So, so as a result of training in the teachings or circle of teachings belonging to the person of small scope, then one gains freedom from the lower realms, and then as a result one gains rebirth in the higher realms like that of human beings and gods. But then as a practitioner, then we continue to train that even when one gains rebirth in higher rebirth, that this is not a state of eternal peace. That even in higher rebirths, we have to contemplate on how there are different types of sufferings. So this is what we did yesterday. We contemplated on how there are general sufferings within samsara, and then specific sufferings that are specific to each of the realms. So therefore we contemplate on the 8 types of sufferings, the 6 types of sufferings, the 3 types of sufferings, and then the specific sufferings that are specific to each of the realms and so forth. And by virtue of contemplating on the nature of suffering within samsara, even though we are in higher states of rebirth, then one generates then one generates renunciation, and with that one generates the intention to seek liberation from samsara altogether.
다드네 이게 동네 뒤에 자와 그거를 생각하는 군주 그래 주는 상가심이지 셰베 동네 뒤에 동네 계다 구다 순다 아니 아니 동네 그래 동네 셰베를 갖다 두수 동네 뒤에 아니 중이 게임을 중요한 말봐 메버리스 아니 산계기 나샤베 말봐 이 메버에 사다 이 간에 좋아해서는 동네디 간에 좋아해서는 주례다 문문이 좋아해서 다들 이제 군주 그런 좀 세야지 군주 템바텔라 레이크 군주다 너무 군주스 다들 레이크 군주 대야 너무 군주가 되는 좋아 다들 이제 군주 그런 좀 삼고 비해서
Then, within the context of Four Noble Truths, then these different types of sufferings, both general and specific, are contemplations belonging to the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering. And after contemplating on these different dimensions and different types of suffering in samsara, then one trains in this understanding that these sufferings do not come about without any causes and conditions, nor are they actually created by Buddhas. So therefore, we begin to then engage in the training or understanding of the second noble truth, the noble truth of the cause of suffering, that suffering has definite causes and conditions. And then when it comes to the second noble truth, the noble truth of cause of suffering, then there are two types of causes, karma and negative emotions. And karma in turn are caused by negative emotions. So in this way, then we contemplate on the nature of the cause of suffering.
동네를 첩치셔 그냥 공부시해봐. 바티 갈래 중앙에서 여를 렘바 레다 문이 중앙에서 어디 제가 레들라 아니 무슨 마인벨레스 무슨 길레지 미유레스 숨이야. 다 무슨 마인벨레스야 등에 속기지길레들이. 미디에 군에 랑사바 답변은 소주바 디탈레리 아니 소주바 디컨데스 중앙에서는 차단 모습 그것이 컨트롤 온디 소주 그것이 차별 온디 소주 그것이 몽베 온디 니좀 마시버지는 소주게 저사 소주바 더부디 베나 미게와 지지게 냐소 계지게 소나메벨레 디샤 레티 근데스 중앙에서는 소제부들에 임바 다티 파자 되는 차다 모습 되는 중앙에서 그것이 차배운 거죠. 그것이 디 몽배운 거죠. 그래서 다 버렸지 차단이 온 거죠. 그래서 그것이 차배운 거죠. 그것이 시단 거 거죠. 차단이부터 가르쳐서는 머리바 마시베 난디 디 머리바티 텔레케니 중앙에 있었다. 대강 걸로 그래서 우리 대디게 동네도 레를 두버지 레디 메모를 두지다 단데 소주기 레를 샤브라바티 샤니다 마디
So then, in terms of suffering, then, as I mentioned yesterday, that we have to understand the most pervasive of all suffering, that is the conditioned suffering, and the conditioned or all pervasive suffering, as I mentioned yesterday, refer to our own karmically propelled psychophysical aggregate. the karmically propelled psychophysical aggregate is in a state of conditioned existence, and so therefore prone to giving rise to different types of sufferings and so forth. So you mentioned that that is the fundamental suffering that we have to understand to give rise to the thought of seeking liberation from samsara altogether. Then, then in terms of understanding or contemplating on the cause of suffering, then as I mentioned, there are two causes. The first is the karma or actions, karmic actions, and then the second cause is the negative emotions or kleshas that give rise to those actions. So then there are karmic actions or karmic karma are divided into three types. There are negative actions, positive actions, and then what is referred to as unwavering actions. So negative actions are those actions like killing that give rise to suffering and that give rise to rebirth within lower realms and so forth. So therefore, if you look at an act of killing, for example, the act of killing itself is actually regarded as a karmic action. But that act of killing, a karmic act, in turn is induced by or triggered by a negative emotion. So negative emotion is the second cause of suffering here. And so one can kill out of different types of negative emotions. For example, one can kill out of anger, one can kill out of desire, one can also kill out of some sort of deluded thinking. But ultimately then all of these negative emotions in turn are there or because of what we call as the primordial ignorance, avidya, the ignorance of clinging to a notion of a false concept of self. That is then the root of all negative emotions, and therefore the root of all karma, karmic actions, therefore the root of all suffering.
That is Nyamotole Tani Shebremis to Chita, Nyamota, Nyamabatus, Deja Shetan, Kondu, Nage, Marina, Tezumimoji, the Tawas, Deja Shetan, Deja Shetan,
Timuk.
Dimuche, Nage, Magic, Ani Tatumari, Tedumimoji, Deja Shetan, Deja Shetan, Maribaje, Deja Shetan, Deja Shetan, Dimuche, Ani Dimuche, Nage,
Tabum.
Ani Tawaje. 대통령님은 이제 어디 딜을 잡에 뭐 단다 차단이 쉬브를 봐 차단이 쉬브를 때 자원이 뭐 딜을다
So generally we talk about three root negative emotions, in which case there are hatred, desire, and ignorance, or sometimes we talk about 6 root negative emotions. So when we talk about 6 root kleshas or negative emotions, then they are hatred, desire, ignorance, pride, jealousy, and then the wrong view, and then the doubt or deluded doubt.
That's it. That's it. That's new possibility. Issues. New issues. That new issues is that new mobile. To put it, get a new ones. To see which chodo the jaggy chodo. Get on the chodo. You move the chodo. Net tower, tower the chodo. That is it. 어두 시제네 녀와세티 녀의 녀모바세티 어디시게 얘는 니需要です
Then we have on top of those six root negative emotions, we have what we call as the 20 approximate negative emotions. 年运, 年运, nishu. So approximate means because they are approximate to the six root negative emotions. So some of these approximate negative emotions belong to the category of desire, some of them belong to the category of hatred or aversion, and then some of them belong to the category of ignorance. So in this way, on top of these six negative emotions, we have also what we call as 20 approximate negative emotions.
that is that 녀의 녀모바다 다른 녀모바다 함제기다 중국 대화디 나시베 나시베 지그디 다 간제 텔라 난지 지그다 나요원 좀 지다스 담보 나이시 다가 신규지 다기 디심을 차지 봤지 담보 나시베 난지디 이네 다기 아니 다기 자신 다기 니스 다기 롱주스 다기 유스니 어딘데기 대기와라 신배 대기와라 잡배 그래서 지다티 기그리스 대기와 좀 지다티
And then the root cause of all of these negative emotions, including the six primary negative emotions and the 20 approximate negative emotions, is what we call as the primordial ignorance, the grasping to a sense of a truly existing self. That in turn, this grasping to a sense of self in turn has two parts to it. One is grasping to a sense of self, and then the other is grasping to a sense of mind. Like my friends and my possessions and so forth. So therefore, grasping in turn functions at two levels. One is grasping to a sense of intrinsically existing self, and because of this, then there is also grasping to a sense of mind, possessions of the self.
다지다 나란도래 다 남기배 나시야디 너를 차인지 잠바 차단디 지다 담바상게다 아니 사통벌레네 베전주 생각도 술에 나야리 나시야디 가사스 지버리 이네 난줄을 너를 차인지 나 남기고 나유야디당 제네 나로 와시 레 징기야레 제상 나주비 나 생이들로디 아니 그뒤께네 나로 와지 기기요 디인사고 나세 베나 뭐버버지랑 초슬레스나 지당 뭐버디 지 남주이나 뭐버디 차단시랑 내르지 수수기 철레 인데 좀 많이 차단기기가 로 시우침 게야디 그 마세디 나순다디 다 만디제 나순다디 만디제 뭐부디랑 철레 인데 좀 받들이 잡아기야다 너무 게야디 지기야 다디 나세야디 나세야디 로디 쳐주디 다 쳐주디 추대 틈도 많이 받지 쳐기야 알아줘.
So when we say that the root cause of all negative emotion is self-grasping or grasping to a sense of inherently existing self, that such a self does not exist. It doesn't mean that therefore self as a conventional entity does not exist at all. The difference is that even the Buddha has a personal self. Even those of high bodhisattvas, the bodhisattvas of the high ground, they also uh, has a personal self. And so therefore, conventionally we have to say that a bodhisattva is a person, an enlightened person is a person, and so forth. But the difference between their experience of the self and our experience of the self is that we experience the self in a diluted way, so to speak, by actually intuitively experiencing self as independent and intrinsically existing. Uh, so that the way in which we engage with the world, the way in which we actually experience the self and engage with the self, is different from the way the Buddhas engage with the world and the Bodhisattvas engage with their self and with the world. So therefore, it doesn't mean that there is no self at all, but rather there's a difference in terms of how we actually experience the self, how we engage with the self, and how we engage with the world. So an example would be if there is some entity, some beautiful thing, some object, prior to making that object into your possession, prior to your possessing that object, if that object is somebody else's object, then the way we actually relate to that object is different. There's no craving, there's no like attachment. But once you buy that object and once you make that object into your possession, then the way you engage with that particular object actually changes. Then there is attachment, there is craving, and so forth. So therefore, what has changed is now the way in which we actually engage with the world, the way we actually engage with the object. So therefore, normally speaking, as ordinary beings, the way the self appeals to us, the way in which the self we experience the self is something that does not actually accord with the reality.
That is Marandula Ngati Chadu Garcity, Alayama Diva Ngati Chegia, the Chadu Jama, Nasi, Ngati Patobe, Le Shadam Ngati, Chartubi Amari, Nonzula. Chida Nasiati and Yag Ngati, Palu Shadam Ngati. Le Pai Shadam Ngati, Charing in Ditamba, you didn't to the Ngati, Nimbo Chan. Grant Yang Ngati, Nandula Chaya, Duty, the couple in the Gub Zang Yungi, dear, and to have Yamara. And we Charia getting Ngati, Hakaya Ngati Cherry. What thing is Hakaya Ngati Charing to go, Kanaya Matu and Arabic, you think that you better debut Ngati Cherry, and the teacher into any use Chatan Jayati. The Mavina Kura Nakura, Patobetar Zam Chi Jamba, the Niti Chavina, Niku Shambachia to Su Tishu Jenny Yule Zimbachimbulia Maria Kurang Akuran Patobet Patazam Ramchi, Mishuchi, you didn't never of Chevieva. Anikula Gazechi, Nobody Gazechi. Susuling Choslenia should chimbukate to be a marchata. Not to the bay, you didn't do an Arab Giovansa and a quick nobody rang Choslane the Zambatilans in the chimbu. Did Korean to Chabakia. Did Torsuna Tato Shetankia or Tindigi lay at the team. Things that Nanga said the Chajutigi, Mirandusam the Chajutigi, that lambing, ranzoli chayindu nga chayindu nga ranzoli chi yari di chayindu zamba yinbu gaje nga tita yinbu chayindu yari odi chayindu san di danti ya maris
So the self that actually exists is a self that is only mentally imputed. So the notion of a self, the notion of the other, all of these things are actually imputed by the mind. So the kind of idea that we have about our own self is actually also imputed by the mind. And mind is not actually the self. But when we experience the self, we don't actually experience this reality of the self, which is actually there. The conventional reality of the self, which is actually a mentally imputed entity. But when we actually experience the self, we experience as if the self exists from its own side, without having to depend on our mind and mental imputation. We actually intuitively feel that the self exists inherently from its own side. So when we have this notion of a self, then all forms of attachment and hatred and all forms of the emotions arise because of clinging to such an intrinsically existing self. But when our mind can actually understand that this notion of a self is nothing but something that is simply labeled or mentally imputed, then the power for the self to give rise to craving and aversion and hatred and so forth actually diminishes, and ultimately it gets destroyed altogether. But the moment or the occasion in which we can actually experience this conventional mentally imputed self is almost like nil. Whenever we actually experience self as actually inherently existing self, something that exists from its own side, which is actually what we call as the object of negation. This is a wrongly conceived notion of the self. This is a misconstrued self. This becomes the object of negation, which basically means that this is something that has to be destroyed through reasoning and philosophical reasoning.
That is nga said each other that is just nga said that been nga said tamba jipa 제가 지는 예약을 소리지 저기 이din에 좀 이어버렸지 공부 때는 이어버렸지 무슨 이어버렸지 아 제가 지는 땅 무슨 안 내버려 아싱이지 공부 때는 수비 공부 때는 말이 소야 공부 때는 말이 다지 셈 때는 말이 뒤 때는 말이 딩이 바로 근데 지요 다지 아란도 되는 하다 주던가 지금 무슨 뜻도 지요 그렇지 덕시대 어디 자인도다 네 나시야디 근데 차이인 주던가 아니 가르쳐 그래 자신들이 하디 다 근데 내주디 도배 받다 따정데 이팀에 도배매 어디 셈이 예배야 부팅에서나 차단제 대야매 다 그래서는 그 수술이 와서 나디 그 주스 매버를 차고 그 주스 매버인데 아니 나는 내가 제세한테 내가 제세 한번 매버 그 주스 매버 아니 지금 내가 제세한테 그 주스 매버를 뒤에서 내가 제세 그 주스 매버를 하고서는 아니 콘도야 매버 어디 소리 지제다 어디 다 데리다 주지 파무 쪽에 냐메 다불라 질레다 갈차스 다디 근데제 자와 말이 베트카레스 아니 디수니 단데는 주 다가랑 갈치는 주 인소 아니 대다도 시험받은 갈치 진주리 어텔은 수네 디 다와니베스 지 수네 베제난 근데야리 텔레테네니 두 개베 소리지베 디 투비시 진로 디는 다와니베스 제사 안된 수 나란도 있는 주디가 능주디 마가나 나란도 나시야나 능주 파가 마가나 아니 로수 나가야면 가제 다디가 가삼해버리 코낭이디 가제 다디다 뭐 되는 게 봐. 띵낭이디 좀 가인디 가제 다디 가인디 다되는 주디 아니는 주디가 아니 한지 니마 둥이 또 버리시지 또 버리시니지 내줘 버치요서 버텔라 니 가져서 그래 아니 티네 티네 저선에 칭이베 니치네 아니 둥이 그래서 더디 동반이 된셔로 지스 숨지도가 피기 가와디 뚜네 피기 가와디 능그도가 나는야 되는 매상고 유스 숨브레시도가 아코니기다 다티 되는 맨에 다트 그래서 체더레진 두선 게지마티지 친구가 어디에서 디두기 깨제 야부치 되게이나 죽으되는 양력부터 시키야래 진입의 딩이를 빼지 시기 죄단도 배제단 분에 다시 제여하니 야부 중그리 남사 제달 풍샤신 친구리 디레야리 어디에서 그게 두 세계 가와디시비야 이때는 또 가와지는 게 아니라 이제 자산 가와드 마가는 이때는 또 가와디 가투야므로 나 이제 아까 시대 좀 만남 시절에 슈리지 동반이 그때 또 이제 나 이제 또 배파다 좀 가와지는 게 어떤 게 소리다 다들 나도 투서 간것이 tomé maribasiati nanti te tubres tigin mo kangatin ya timbres
So when we actually experience the self, or the way in which the self appears to us, it appears to us as if it exists from its own side. It exists in the psychophysical aggregate. So when we talk about the self, the reference point of the self is, or the basis of labeling or basis of imputation for the self is our mind and body, or what we call as the psychophysical aggregate. So when we actually experience the self, we experience as if the self exists from its own side, as if if we were to try to find where the self is, that we will be able to actually pinpoint to an ultimate reference point in our mind or body and say that this is the self, because we think that the self exists from the side of the object, from its own side. If that is the case, if the self exists like that, irrespective of on labeling, if the self exists from its own side, and if the self exists in the psychophysical aggregate, then it is the case that we will have to be able to pinpoint to a reference point and say this is the self. But even though that is how we actually experience it, when we engage in analytical meditation, then we try to find and locate where the self is. Intuitively, we experience that self exists from its own side. Then we try to locate where the self is in our mind and body. Then we find that the body is not the self, the feelings are not the self, even the mind is not the self. So therefore, through this kind of analytical search, we don't actually find a reference point. So therefore, we know that there is some sort of difference between the way the self appears to us and actually the way the self truly exists, which is that there is no final reference point, that we cannot find the self in the basis of imputation, which is in our mind and in the body. So, so not finding that the self does not exist from its own side, from the side of the object, that itself is simply a mental label imputed by our mind. If we actually understand that, then we will actually experience that, we will be freed from desire and hatred, craving and aversion. And the reason for that is, if there is no substantial self or a truly existing self, then external things, including other beings, cannot actually hurt that notion of a self, because that notion of the self actually does not exist. It is something that is mentally labeled. So therefore, because the self cannot be hurt, there is no way the self can actually give rise to aversion or hatred. Likewise, the self does not actually experience attachment. So, therefore, the key point here is trying to understand what is the object of negation. What we are trying to negate. When we look at on self, or when we look at the table, we say that the self of the table does not exist, and so therefore there is a misconception that has to be negated. So that is called the object of negation. So therefore, usually in meditations on selflessness or emptiness, the most important aspect is being able to identify the object of negation. So, so there's a story about the great Mahasiddha Phagmudugwa. When his student Nyame Thagbul Hajin asked him to actually identify, to reveal him or to teach him or instruct him how to actually identify the root primordial ignorance. In other words, what is the object of negation? Reportedly, the Mahasiddha Phagmudugwa said that the way the self appears to you, the way you actually experience the self, that itself is basically the way the object of negation is experienced. Apart from your own actually experience, you shouldn't try to look for some other thing that you would say that is the object of negation. The way all appearances appears as if they truly exist from their own side. Ordinarily, that is the case. So therefore, all appearances, including the appearance of the self, becomes the object of negation, because that does not exist. So it is said that. So therefore, if you look at a table, or if you look at this, if you look at the self, it necessarily appears as if it exists from its own side. So ordinarily, all appearances therefore become an object of negation. Ordinarily, all appearances become a misconception. So therefore, has to be negated. So it is said that based on this pithy instruction, that Nyame Thagbul Hajin found the view of emptiness. So therefore, in our meditations on emptiness, if we try to look for something else to negate, apart from what appears to us, whether it is that we are looking at a table, and then we are looking at the selfness of the table, or whether looking at our own personal self, there's a natural, intuitive way in which we actually experience the self, or the self appears to us. That itself is the object of negation. Apart from that, if we try to look for something else that to negate, then we are not actually doing the meditation properly. So this is a very subtle point, and there's another story that one time there was a great yogi who was meditating in the caves and reputedly has actually understood emptiness directly. And then it said that one time two debaters, two logicians, geshes, actually went to that yogi who was meditating and who is reputed to have understood emptiness directly. And these two logicians asked two scholars asked the yogi to teach them what emptiness is, to reveal to them what emptiness is from his own experience. And then it is said that the yogi pointed to the pillar in his meditation cell, and he said that, when I look at this pillar, it appears as if that pillar exists from its own side. But I actually, from my own experience, understand that this pillar does not exist. So it is said that at that, the logicians actually thought that, the yogi, the meditator, has fallen into a nihilistic position by saying that this pillar does not exist. But the logicians, the scholars, actually missed the point. That in fact, if they were to persist and continue to ask, then that interaction would be very meaningful, because the yogi could actually tell how emptiness is experienced from the point of view of personal experience, and then the scholars and the logicians can actually use their own philosophy and scholastics and philosophy and learning to actually even further analyze what emptiness is and how emptiness is experienced. But because of the use of word, and because of not actually able to appreciate how difficult it is to communicate the experience, it is said that the scholars or the logicians actually left disappointed, thinking that that yogi has actually fallen into a state of nihilistic position. So therefore, all of these are basically to underscore the importance of the primordial ignorance, the root primordial ignorance, which is grasping to a false notion of the self, and how that actually is the cause of all negative emotions, and how that therefore is the cause of all karmic actions, and therefore of suffering, and how therefore the wisdom of emptiness, or the wisdom of selflessness, is the wisdom that can directly eliminate this primordial ignorance.
That go to guess something quality tandu look said to then miss some mountain or cover to me that go to miss somebody penny to make it and that to somebody penny that tandu look that tandu look in this charity lotus and a kanban member lungi pibe na tu cheba le chebe cheba tangsta kangba member we ni lungi na kangba member na chusona ani dele pende glochki graba o cheba tangus jamba junga ne sabra jebe lo cheta mi jeba tita bu kwale tandu lo chema mani sibe pendo jini jumba sikine shiktersta jumba jungune tarwa debati lodi katutana samche ku kalase de tingri ji jumba ji takar sugre jumba 쉬어야 돼. 솔 그래서 그래. 솔 바이야기다지. 이제 네바치 파네 전에 다 주시나. 자꾸 니 특하도 세세들이 정가들이 타는데 로티기 그러나. 얘는 멤버를 강바치기 나는 게 주스는 강바들이 아니 단독 로티시 붙기 그러나. 디너시 아니 다티네 지 디데 주스는 그랬더니 탄나 저백가 중나 세그 유제 탐제 주는 거야. 전때는 지금 저백가 중나 그렇지 세그로 진데 이네 잘라로 주인데 또 스잖니 차심에 집지 주그러 봐. 디나신지 지 그의 편도를 맞춰가지네. 어디를 탈덕지야 돼. 로지 된지 지게서는 단독으로 세치다 된지.
So, in this way, the purpose of contemplating on suffering in the beginning, general suffering of samsara and specific sufferings and so forth, is to give rise to renunciation, or which is other way of saying to give rise to the thought of seeking liberation. So, the standard or measure of having developed renunciation or the thought of seeking liberation is actually likened to someone who is caught up in a burning house. And if someone is caught up in a burning house, or if someone is actually is in prison to be executed in a year or something. So you can so these, and if we have such individuals, then the thought of that prisoner to actually escape would be there at all times. Whether that prisoner is eating or sleeping, the thought of actually wanting to escape or gain freedom from the prison would always be there. So therefore, it is said that the measure of having generated renunciation and thought of seeking liberation is very much like that. That after repeatedly contemplating on suffering within conditioned existence of samsara, when one generates the wish to escape from samsara to such an extent, like the prisoner who is to be executed wants to escape from his own prison, then that is the measure of having generated genuine renunciation. So once that prisoner, for example, gains an opportunity to escape, he would escape, and he would leave behind all of his possessions, like whatever he had, without any kind of attachment. He would be very happy to leave that behind and then run. So very much like that, when the thought of seeking liberation comes to that intensity or to that level, then one is no longer attached to the happiness or luxuries within conditioned existence of samsara.
다 제를 묻히게 되네. 대다를 공대 그 편도라 이미 깨지잖아요. 이게 인지 꿈도 하고 있는 거. 중간 뒤뒤는 죽게발라 스타디 제를 묻혔어. 대다를 공대에서 공도 시에 돈이게 선발 구하지다 지랑 돈에 선발을 때니 아니 대다를 공대 시베 편도라 아니 대다를 공대 시베 편도라 이미 깨졌다는 게 이미 믿기 인지군도 타봤더니 중났다니 니주도 삼백제가 됐죠.
So Tsongkhapa put this measure of having general renunciation in this verse where he wrote that in this way, or after meditating in this way, which basically means meditating on sufferings within such existence, when there comes a time that one is no longer attached to the happiness and the luxuries of samsara, even for a minute or even for a moment, but day and night one generates the wish to gain liberation from samsara single-pointedly, then that is the measure of having given rise to genuine or authentic renunciation.
That in the Nijuku Sambati, that Nijuku Sambati and catching and Donagi Donga Gandhi, Trevor Dejan, Doi Lamla Tenenta, Naganamla Tenet, and Kuali Trevor Dejan, Sambatini, Lamgi Shima, Shide, Memiru Shenes, Nijuku Sambatini, Lamgi Shiden to Memiru Shene, Yamangi Tijeva Catches. Tati, the other queer to me combated Tambe Shul. You catch your in the caressing. Where did I need you to go to somebody? Tambe Chula, Lojubas, Jamdu Shuda Chuna, Lay Jundela easy Yevach, Cindy Lloyd Tonga, Cindy Lloyd Tonga, Koala Joshing. Semjela Jambata Nijiso Sanam Ginde Tanji Shiten Yinis. What I did, Niju somebody.
So, therefore, renunciation is considered as the very foundation of all Sudrik and Tantric paths. That whether one wanted to seek the state of enlightenment through following the Sudrik path or through following the Tantric path, that the common necessary foundation to traverse on these levels of path is renunciation. That renunciation is the necessary foundation of all the paths, and without this, one cannot actually traverse on different levels of the path, whether it is in the context of sutra or whether it is within the context of tantra. And that is because if there is genuine renunciation and the wish to seek liberation by contemplating on and understanding the different types of sufferings and the causes of sufferings and so forth, then that is the renunciation, that becomes the cause of entering into the spiritual path or dharma path. It also becomes the cause for giving rise to a very powerful refuge within oneself. It also becomes the cause for cultivating conviction in the law of causality or karma. It also becomes the cause where one can actually give or sacrifice attachment to this life and the luxuries of this life, and therefore it also becomes the cause for giving rise to love and compassion for other sentient beings. So therefore, in this way, then we realize that renunciation is the basis or the very foundation of all the qualities of the different levels of paths and grounds, whether it is within the context of Sudra or within the context of Tantra.
That Dendi Yala Juni that Koaju to somebody, then the Nanga said it, Dendi Yala Juni Yala Tambu Mariba Sinit. Niba Dujigles, Maribe Queen Lani, Chatana Supertene, Dujigles, Sinba Dujigle, Letilia, Gavelleta, Miguel Nimba. Miguel letting a sonkia, Gavelleti had a 디 머리베고는 사 아니 니버 뒤지기 됐어 순반남식이 된지스 시바 민수스 나바기지스 머리바스 인버초지 예바시바지 월렘바지 주바시바스 실레시 된데 주바시바 주지바 개와지 중미버 것이스다 개와렘 되는 한 마시에 것이스 어때 된데 야가 중이 딜롱 중시
So then the way in which one is propelled within conditioned existence in the existence of suffering through the 12 links of dependent origination. So earlier I mentioned that the way in which one encircles within samsara conditioned existence and how to get rid of, how to gain freedom from that. There are two systems. One is the Four Noble Truths, the other is the 12 links of dependent origination. So in terms of the dependent origination, this misconceived notion of the self that I mentioned earlier, the clinging to an intrinsically existing notion of a self, that is the first link of the 12 links of dependent origination. In the 12 links of dependent origination, we say, primordial ignorance, or avidya. So that is basically the first link, the link of ignorance. And then ignorance, which really refers to the misconception pertaining to the self. That ignorance then that induces negative emotions then giving rise to karmic actions. So the second link is link of compositional actions. And then compositional actions referring to karmic actions has two within the conditioned existence. There are positive actions which give rise to rebirth within higher realms of human beings and gods, and then there is the negative actions, karma, that give rise to rebirth within lower realms like animals and hungry ghosts and so forth. And then these actions are then imprinted on the third link, the link of consciousness. And then the fourth link is a link of name and form, nama rupa. Then the fifth link is link of sense generators, sense faculties. Then sixth link is link of contact. Then the next is link of feelings. Then the next is link of craving. Then the next is link of attachment. And then the next link is link of existence or bhavana, which is also a karma, which gives rise to, or which is becomes the condition for giving rise to the 11th link, which is the link of rebirth, and then birth, and then the next 12th link is the link of aging and death.
That's it. That's it. Dendi yala jungina de le ni ya ni ba tu ji le se ju ba si le si ni ba tu ji le se ju pen ji le si ju ba si le se di pen ji le se de sa de dang bu de di dang chu ani ju ba si le se di sa de da cha ni ni chu da ji da yu li su ba ji ni Debuke chujo soya ledila. Jawa chujo sileji. Chuba sileji. Lenji. Mimo sumiyade. Yala kampu mari bata mimo de. Ani Java lemba, Java siba. Kuba lemba subu. That means she does it. You put it that Tedale in the Jubi, Jebru, she does.
So of the 12 links of dependent origination, there are two karmic actions there are three negative emotions, and then the rest are results or resultant suffering. So of the 12 links of dependent origination, the two common actions are the second compositional action and the 10th existence or bhavana or becoming, which is also an action, sipa. The second action, which is the second compositional action, is very much like the first karmic action, which is imprinted, which is likened to the seed being planted. But when the seed is planted, then that seed requires other conditional factors like sun's heat, fertilizers, and so forth, for it to become so ripe to give rise to a fruit or some resultant state. So that condition is the 10th karma, which is the karma of becoming or existence or bhavana, sipa. And so sipa is like the conditional factor. So bhavana or becoming makes the resultant makes the seed so ripe to give rise to result, and the next moment it gives rise to the result. So then of the 12 links of dependent origin, the three are kleshas or negative emotions. So those three are the first primordial ignorance, which is definitely a klesha. Then the 8th craving is also a negative emotion, and the 9th attachment, that is also a negative emotion. So then the rest 7 are actually resultant suffering.
다드네 단예바 다버드레 남기래 시대는 파발라니.
So now we go to the next part of the teaching cycle of teaching from the person of middle scope, where it says determining the nature of the path for going to liberation.
생기고 올라지다죠. 생겨지다죠. 남부 생기고 올라지다죠. 그때 저러한 신주 숨지. 남부 저한이 때문에 군들라마라 라벨은 통화도 지선서. 가 이제 누나 시제. 얘네 다다 말씀드린 단계. 고아라기에 유일된가 슈타베 동에나서 중요한지 타바띵이 글로기에네 람라바 순다 최신 말레베 렘버도스 두베 다다 말씀제 탄제글로 얘네 람라바 순다 최신 너네 징글로 소리 시에서한테 지금에 생각은 개발도야 타바도 이게 알로이티네 람라바스 수신 불러버 제가 이제자 그 당시 얘기는 제가 손으로 좀 타바도 이걸로 이제네 람라바스 수신 불러베 또가 제바제라 신규로 제가 상모 스타디 좋아지잖아.
So then it says that with regard to determining the nature of the path for going to liberation, there's 3 sections: the preparatory section, the actual session, and the concluding session. And then what to do in between sessions. So in terms of the actual meditation session, it is again preparation. So the preparation is very much like we did earlier. That is to visualize the Guru Deity on top of a crown, and then to engage in the supplication as before. And this is vividly put here in 2 lines. I pray to you, composite of the objects of refuge, my Lama special deity, subdue King Vajratara. But after doing this, then you go through this brief meditation. All sentient beings, my mothers, and I have been born in circular existence and have experienced a variety of intense sufferings for a long time. This is due to not learning properly the path of the three trainings after developing a desire for liberation. Therefore, Lama deity, please bless all sentient beings, my mothers, and me, now to be able to learn properly the path of the three trainings after developing a desire for liberation. With this supplication, again, just as before, you visualize streams of nectar coming down from the Guru deity through the crown of all sentient beings. These streams enter the bodies and minds of all sentient beings in yourself. Thereby, all the misdeeds and obscurations accumulated from beginningless time are purified. In particular, these streams purify all the misdeeds, obstructions, sickness, possessions, which prevent learning properly the path of the three trainings after developing a desire for liberation. So then you cultivate the conviction that you and your bodies of all sentient beings transform into nature that is pristine, clear, and radiant. And it gives rise to all qualities like lifespan and so forth, and particularly it gives rise to the realization of learning properly the path of the three trainings after developing renunciation or developing a desire for liberation. So, in this particular meditation or visualization, there's a mention of three trainings, where it says learning properly the path of the three trainings after developing a desire for liberation. After generating the wish to seek liberation or renunciation, then one prays here to engage in the proper practice of the three trainings. So the three trainings, within the three trainings, all the practices that are required to seek liberation or to gain liberation are actually included. So that's what this is very important here, to mention the three trainings. So the three trainings are training in morality, training in concentration, and training in wisdom. Hila, Samadhi, and Prajna. So morality, training in morality, Sheila, what it means is if we look at our earlier example of the 10 negative actions, how do we incorporate the three trainings to get rid of the 10 negative actions? Morality or training in morality helps the practitioner to cultivate external discipline so that one does not get distracted to external negative actions, including actions of challenging and destroying enemies and subduing enemies and protecting friends and so forth, and therefore engaging in many physical actions. So all of these physical actions are actually stopped through the practice of morality. Then training in concentration helps one to get rid of internal distractions in the form of mental agitation and mental dullness, and also internal distraction in the form of gross negative emotions. So the gross manifest negative emotions one is able to actually eliminate or suppress through practice of concentration or samadhi. And then the next level of training in wisdom, is what actually eliminates the root of all these gross negative emotions, which is basically primordial ignorance. So the primordial ignorance is eliminated through training in wisdom, which is basically the wisdom that realizes selfness or emptiness. So in other words, what we find is that there are three levels, they are all interrelated. First of all, there is the root of ignorance, which is primordial ignorance, and that primordial ignorance one has to get rid of through training in wisdom. But when we are not able to do so, then primordial ignorance gives rise to manifest negative emotions. Manifest negative emotions like anger and so forth. So these manifest negative emotions are suppressed through training in samadhi or concentration, including mental dullness and agitation and so forth. These are suppressed through training in samadhi. And when these gross or manifest negative emotions are not suppressed or not controlled or not subdued, then it gives rise to negative external behavior in the form of physical and vocal negative actions. These in turn are then controlled or subdued or disciplined through the practice of morality or training in morality or training in Shila. So therefore we find that these three levels of training are interconnected and interrelated.
Tambo tada tadi orang mesti ranking ketuan sampai logik, ini logik. Di tada sungai le tiada, nanti tada sungai le ngada, ngayu tada sungai le tiada, ini rajo le cabat, sendo le tada gigi. Nanti rumah tiada ini, nanti ini kita tada sungai le tiada, tada tada sungai le
So then we go through the actual session. So therefore it says, meditating on the Lama Devi seated upon the crown of one's own head, contemplate as follows. Consciousness itself is neutral. Neutral in the sense that it is neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. with respect to consciousness, there is produced a mind that conceives inherent existence after observing self and its possessions. Depending on that mind's conception of self, there is produced wrong views such as attachment to that associated with self, aversion to that associated with other, and pride which conceives oneself as superior to others. So therefore, what is mentioned here is that even though consciousness itself is neutral, that consciousness gives rise to a sense of a self, which then creates the notion of self and others, which then creates the duality of the self, and then giving rise to aversion and craving. So now therefore the description of the consequences of the primordial ignorance of grasping to a truly existing sense of self. Therefore it says, so this created the duality of self and others, and then therefore that gives rise to aversion to that associated with other, and attachment to that associated with self. And that also in turn induces pride, which conceives myself as superior to others. And then depending on those, then there is also production of wrong views, such as conceiving the non-existence of the Buddha, who indicates selflessness, and also the non-existence of the three jewels and the Four Noble Truths and the cause and effect of karma and so forth, as taught by the Buddha. And so depending on these wrong views, then negative emotions or afflictive emotions spread, and through the influence of negative emotions, when accumulate actions giving in turn giving rise to unwanted sufferings within conditioned existence. So therefore, this is basically the description of the impact of the primordial ignorance, how it basically turns the wheel of samsara. So we're going to stop here this morning. Come to one caution.
Self exists, is only mentally imputed, and I have found, like, if you do this meditation where you start analyzing and looking for the self, you know, is it in the body, is it in the mind, and you start decomposing all the different components that we believe make the self, we you know, hopefully we arrive to the notion that there's nothing that we are thinking as a self. is it normal for a sensation of happiness to arise? My question is it normal that happiness arises when we try to find that self? You know, when you decompose everything, there is this feeling of happiness because there's like if all opportunities were present. Or what is it that we are supposed to experience while trying to find the self? What should arise? I mean, probably nothing because there's the notion that there's no self, hopefully. But you know what I mean? But I find that there's a lot of happiness that is created by just trying to find, I mean, not finding the self. Not trying to find it, not finding the self.
For
I don't know if it was too
딜레기, 담내기,
They call it bliss.
Thank you. It's true, sorry.
근데 낙맥이 나 이렇게 제버체제 다 가고도 다 그다 가르쳐 또 되네 제버만 고치 되고 다딱 매버디 또 보이나 아니 디기 대화지 딩그르베스 대화 딩그르베 당무 또 대화 친구라
아직 그렇습니다. 대원딩이 지다 디카도를 통해 제인지니야리스. 니네 동반이를 부바시다 제딩이지는 그 토마토 인지 참했지. 노자 친구지. 토베 나올 나시지. 가와치레기야리스. 아야 Chila, Niemana pe taatu tawatil kumbalateni, koha hodi kana tamito indujama, ngobu za chimbuchitore, chinawaji chegias. Dane so sama. Ngobu tam za chimbuchitore nawaji tugere. Did umani togiaris.
So eventually, of course, it induces joy and bliss. But it is said that in the beginning, the moment one perceives emptiness or understands emptiness, it is said that there are two types of individuals. One individual actually experiences joy and happiness, and these individuals are those who have actually contemplated on emptiness for many times, for long periods of time. And so for them, the experience is like finding something very precious that they have lost for a long time, and then finding it finally. So therefore, it says initially, these individuals who are so used to contemplating on emptiness, they have that experience of joy, intense joy. But it is said that for other practitioners, it is also possible to give rise to, in the first moment, like intense fear of losing something that they so cherished for so long time. And that is for those individuals who have not contemplated on emptiness for a long time, but are so used to, clinging to an intrinsic notion of a self, that for those individuals, when they experience emptiness for the first time, the first moment actually induces fear of losing something very precious. But both of these are actually signs of perceiving emptiness, nonetheless. And then eventually it gives, not finding the self, selflessness is cause of bliss and joy.
I have a question too. I don't want to take up too much time on the rest. Should I ask it later or should I ask now? No. I feel like
Ask it now.
okay. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like alright. My question is like whenever I try to like analyze selflessness, like in like meditation or something, I can't get past like I can there's this feeling which is everyone has, I'm sure it's a very basic thing, but like it feels like there's something that is listening to my thoughts, something that is analyzing my perceptions, kind of. And I can go through like logic, kind of like I can see how that can't really be the case, but I can't like experience it any other way. Like it seems like trapped in that. Like I can't break that down. But like my question is, when that's happening, when I'm experiencing that, what is actually happening in my mind? Is it like that I'm thinking a thought, and then like right afterwards I'm like remembering the thought I'm thinking, but it's happening, like, you know what I'm saying, but it's happening too fast for me to realize that's going on. I don't know. I don't know. Is that?
Can you ask again?
Does that does not make sense? Oh boy.
So that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
그 저기 네 딱 그런 남부 공부라.
그래.
남부 공부가 다다 디치는 민도와 안 디치는 민도와 다 디치는 다 딜레이 민도와 근데 그 남부 공부였어. 공부가 야 생기 초지기로 와. 아니 얘 공개 그때 딸인지도 있어. 근데 그 친구도 다 그거 있어. 근데 그 가르치고 그랬어. 지금 오늘 그런데 따되게 여러 შემ버지 양문이 고랑기 디 템버도 줄었어. 얘뭐 통계 줘라. 이 템버지기 디 강도 통도를 터지기 템버지 숨제 강서 강 따되게 이 템버도 친 템버도 지나
그래. 나지 디스 단이 디셈디다. 다스디 간사디 그것도 다스. 야 셈 제베치디야 코스. 야 가가르바. 근데 간사를 제베치디 좀 봐. 단이 디셈디다. 간사디 그것도. 다디 데리아리스. 디기 디고 간사예를 네베키 게임마레스 예바지야지. 디고 커런트 셈디기 다 생각하시니 뒤에는 다 제베지게라. 다 제베지게 수치지. 인구데.
So Rimji says, of course, because of habit and conditioning, we can't help but think that even though analyzing is done by the mind, it is not the self. The mind is not actually the person or the self. But we can't help but think that that is also, yourself, watching yourself, so to speak.
Right.
But really, what is happening is, you have to first of all experience how you actually experience the self. And once you do that, then it's your mind going through this analysis of how you experience yourself and whether there is such a self. And so all the analysis is actually done by consciousness or awareness, which is not the mind.
디야지 안도 가야지 나오에 간사디 거기에서 기다 가야지 나오에 간사디 두에서 주차례인데 정말 갈라마드베 나를 지쳐야 됐어 아베지 나나시도 베지 오늘 송서도 나 지쳐야 됐어 디파자가 지는 네 매버지 기다는 나디에 거기야 말했어.
So also we have to understand that we are not trying to negate self altogether. We're not trying to negate conventional self. But as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about self at this stage, we don't actually experience the mentally labeled self, which is the conventional self. We only experience the intrinsically truly existing self, which is not there. So therefore, we're trying to negate that. We are negating the object of negation self, that is the intrinsically existing self, that is the self that we think exists from its own side, from the psychophysical aggregate. So we have to, be able to actually identify that through one's own experience. And then all your reasoning has to negate that, not just self per se.
나 동네 탐지 자와 탈두는 머리보다 두 배. 그래 동네 타다 되는 건데. 남아산이 무관시 저거다 뒤치도 남 라바를 붙인 친차를
그게 되네.
됐었다 뒤치는다 단다 공도 나다가 이거 집 넘어진 시에가 네 그랬더니 시에서 대나스 동네 탐지 기타와 탈수가 말이 바라 두개스 말이 바이 두스 인사다 그 동네 싸워내 건데 남아서 이제 말하고 있죠 이제도 남루가 버리는 조심을 나버죠 개벌 수는 페이 치시 마수는 이미 신주체 저두배 달기 지들 캐나데 수주 소치야 미담을 주신 수죠
So we'll continue on the actual session where it says, therefore the root of all suffering is finally ignorance. So this thought or this understanding comes from our prior contemplation or meditation on how the primordial ignorance or self-grasping is the root of all negative emotions and therefore root of all karmic actions and therefore root of all suffering. So now therefore we are concluding here, therefore the root of all suffering is finally ignorance. Thus I will attain by all means the high state of Lama Buddha, who has abandoned from the root all of the sufferings of existence. In order to do that, I will learn properly the path of the three precious trainings that we mentioned earlier, the three levels of trainings, and in particular, I'll observe ethics, since there is great benefit, and if I do not, there is extremely great adverse effect.
세상다 되는 인터넷에 소화들이도 라파르도 세야지 아니 개발도 수는 편이 제시 수는 이미 신도 채울도 베스 여기 지다 어디 캐나데 다 주dim디 다른 두고 가수베 디버지야 메시지 개발도 버지스 렌게 그 시에버바 다 주dim세야디 소다도 또 봤을 때 인구에 말 알아두베 미게 좀 주부티 아니 수나 페미신도 쳐 마수는 이미 신도 쳐왔어 지금서 캘린더에 수짐 아니 디 인사 알아두 미게 주 초점때 마수는 닝 예바신도 쳐왔대 그래서 내서도 기기가 다 수준 수는 아니 페미신도 쳐 지단 년주에 타와 대주 대상토와 아니 수준 수는 라바팅이 라바 시르기 라바양 아니 저지가 윤대 탐지기 시대 주딩 유담이 주 윤대 탐지기 시대스 와티사 베네사디 주어스나라는 소자리 셈 미주어스네 자신나 스테리 투수관계 때인데 사직이 여러분 디나 신기 인데 탐지기 때인데 주dim인지 제산다 디나의 개발도 pen chesin masonen mi cheve sawatete laba sumbi nani chudungi laba tish. Jida kenan be chudungi, sogi chemi dunga, chuishin sunga jingila suyo siyara, sunga chawusi. Dati jeduga suwa teleti.
So therefore it says, in particular, if I observe ethics, there is great benefit, and if I do not, there is extremely great adverse impact. Therefore, I'll observe ethics properly, as I promised, without giving up, even if it should cost my own life. So, ethics here does not necessarily refer to the vows that we have taken within the context of individual liberation vows or bodhisattva vows or tantric vows. Ethics here refers to observance of morality in general, irrespective of whether we have actually taken a pledge or not. And so therefore this moral ethics, it describes here as great benefit if one observes it. And the reason why it is said that is because it is said that moral ethics is actually the basis or the foundation of all other spiritual qualities. That if you look at the true training in concentration and training in wisdom, both of these actually true trainings and their realizations are actually dependent on their being observance of moral ethics. So therefore moral ethics is the foundation of all virtues or qualities. It is usually likened to the great earth, which is the foundation of those that are moving and those that are not moving. So moving and unmoving things. Moving things refers to sentient beings, unmoving things refers to inanimate objects. So, but the great earth is the foundation of all of these things. So very much like that, their moral ethics is likened to the earth is likened to the earth, and therefore it is the foundation. In that it is the foundation of all other qualities.
주dimdi 신도 개체로다 딘다 미기 조금 주dim니 mondogni likungi 시지고 아베체다 mondog이 주dim디 미기 조금 주dim디 mondog이 내리 타바다 담지 켐바 니게 비투리 세상 요리스 다 미기 조금이 주니 유이주권에서 다 됐지. 되나 지다를 쓰면 되나 이년도 생기 랑소 랑소나 지다를 쓰면 매거든. 자와다 배나 소주 때부지기는 생기 랑그 소지나 수도자는 야마로다 제쇼 소르바 디나신 제네니 생기 소주디 봉 가르스 소주는 그 말이스 랑기 제 생기구나 네 메세바나시 네 랑기 생기 제구 그 말이스 생기텔에 누버치리 마리스 네 로임 제나 네 어디 로임 다티네 신체니 쓰다메바 갈라 되나 니마리리 신순 티엔지야 투자 심지 수라야 메시냐바 니마리리 신도 어느 땡기 좀 지리네 저 땡기 좀 차순체 니마리리 신을 배 다링에 소지 지금이 나야 지금이 삼프지 대신이 생기 제라는 거 지금이 삼프지 대신 로임 지금이 선배들이 주임하기미 집바 니마리리 로직 전화 로직 나와직 타나 니마지 춘제도 아니 메자 선배 걔네 제비나 아니 앞에 신도 챔버를 다디 인다지 그래서 돌에 강기 깨봐 강계 진이도 다음에 생기 세다困难다 두다 반대 마음에 청하니 산지 지와 터지 림주제 강기 담주럽도 집어다 대 림주제 제 강기 담주럽도 집어다 대시 템바 가버리 주제지 년지 돈이 라바 직전에 손진이 되게 하버리 그러스 라바 직전에 남에게 있는 손님들이 손님 쳐유스 그래서는 대시 그래서 우리 강기 담주럽도 집어 담배 쳐럽도 집어 대시 그때마다 땅값을 들였잖아 아니 이제 또 라바 직전에 소주로 집봉네 아니 남의 텔레폰이 쳐 인스지 어디 돌려서
So, observance of moral ethics, including refraining from the 10 negative actions, is the ground of all other qualities or other spiritual realizations, as I mentioned earlier, of training and realizations of concentration and wisdom and so forth. But also the moral ethics is what is responsible for giving rise to rebirth in higher realms, and also the moral ethics is what is responsible for giving rise to freedom from samsara. So therefore, in that sense, moral ethics becomes the foundation of all higher qualities. So therefore, one should train in refraining from the 10 negative actions by engaging in this understanding and thinking that says that, for example, with respect to refraining from killing, that if someone were to kill oneself, then one would not be able to tolerate that. So the pain, the suffering would be intolerable. So very much like that, then one makes a commitment to refrain from killing. So very much like that, we apply the logic with the rest of the 10 non-virtuous actions, like stealing. Just as like if somebody steals one's precious possession, one won't be able to tolerate it, one will suffer greatly. Very much like that, by that logic, we refrain from, one makes a commitment to refrain from stealing, and then one refrains from engaging in sexual misconduct because it harms the other, and so forth. So in this way, one generates the morality of refraining from the 10 negative actions. And in the sutra, with respect to explaining the benefit of observance of morality, in the sutra the Buddha said that if one were to make offerings to countless Buddhas for countless eons with precious objects numbering the number of sands in the Ganges River, on the banks of, in the Ganges River, if one were to make offerings to all the countless Buddhas for countless eons, and on the other hand, if one were to observe even one moral ethics during this degenerate time, when the very existence of Dharma is in danger, the benefit of observing a single morality, even for a day, that is like, for example, a moral observance of refraining from killing, or observing that wholeheartedly in a day, for one day, it is said that the virtue so accrued would be far greater than making offerings, the numbering the sands in the river Ganges to countless number of Buddhas for countless eons. So therefore, if one can make a commitment on a daily basis, and the way we can make this commitment is we can do it in front of a statue in one's own shrine, and to make a commitment that today I'm not irrespective of what the external conditions may be, that I'm going to refrain from killing other sentient beings. I'm going to refrain from stealing. I'm going to refrain from harming other sentient beings. So if on a daily basis we make a commitment and then observe it during the day, the power, the benefit of such observance of moral ethics is, as I mentioned earlier in the sutras, is extremely great.
That is Tamba Nyambata do me to the Jevati, Shira Pain Chimbi Matita, Pena Mugi Duigi say Mugi Duigi say Rangusuna Chimshi Devas Migudu Surana say Ran Long Jekijuna and Shitag Simbutan Chi Akarasure Chimbi Gurva. The Mugitus Chinea also Chimbish Wingarva. Namgi said Chimbale, Mugitus said Chimbina, Shirang also Chimbinguri. Mugitus said Zonayam. And it's Shiragi Chimbura. What in I see Sanji them chewing Yambata, Demba Yambet to I mean, Labati Jenny. We could do children sooner that other time, the aid is only a Shidagi Kasa paying chamberings, what they did it and Betty did it.
So the reason why observance of even a single moral ethics during the degenerate times, during the time when the very teachings are in danger of getting lost, why that is far more powerful and effective from a karmic point of view is because it's very much like the preciousness of food during times of famine and hunger. During times of famine and hunger, if one were to get some food, that food would be much more valuable than the food that we might obtain during normal times. And that food during times of famine, even if one were to sell that food, would be much more costly than the food that we have usually at normal times, because the benefit is far greater, because the time is very critical. So similar to that example, it is said that when the very existence of teachings, Dharma, is actually in danger, then observance of even a single moral ethics, like killing, for example, is of great value because of that.
Oh, that is great. I mean, Chudim said that Tibapon, Chudim Labati Tibapons, Chaviba, that you get. Oh, Bolia, 11 nation, Chudim Lava, Labe, doing so cheap. You want Tanjapons, that can get Shine December, Chi yon the Tanji, make it make it Judah so that this week, 1 year. Just a chicken the bottom on a check here. And then thing shooting a lava the bottom. 띵은지 라버티 냐모 문조 시럽질 라버티 냥데 토지스 단지 본디 이게 지시빈다 머리 비자리스 치워디도 집어버리 다 제서 어디리 제서 다 주dim디 개침부시고 지메지 다디 나란주 라네 첨부야 게마드니 커두기 냥네디다 라라 영향이 미기주 주dim디 디제는 아니 냥두도 지게야 말이 된두리 게투리야 된두리 게서야 된두리 된다 슈투가 단디 지금도 제서 주딩 라버디 개침부시게 되네 주딩 게 라버디 이베 시딩 돈에 아니 땡게지 라버디 시르고 라버스 세르기 아니 야 그나 공부 해야지
So, as I mentioned this morning, observance of moral ethics helps us to refrain from engaging in negative actions. So the outward physical manifestation of our negative emotions express itself in negative actions. So when we have commitment to observe moral ethics help us to refrain from actually acting on those negative impulses, negative thoughts, so that they become negative actions. So therefore, morality helps us to check negative actions, and so therefore help us from engaging in sin or negative actions. And then training and concentration helps us to, as I mentioned earlier, helps us to subdue, manifest or gross negative emotions. And then training in wisdom helps us to get rid of the root cause of samsara, leading to the state of nirvana or liberation. So therefore, moral ethics therefore becomes the very foundation of all these qualities, and so it's extremely important. So even though we may not be able to engage in high practices, if we are practical about engaging in moral ethics or refraining from the 10 negative actions on a daily basis, because this is something that we kind of encounter or face on a daily basis. If we make a commitment to refrain from negative actions, 10 non-virtuous actions, then that ensures that observance of morality, as its result, ensures that we will take rebirth in higher realms. And when we take rebirth in higher realms, again and again, we have opportunity to engage in the spiritual practices, dharma practices, and so forth. And therefore, ultimately, we get the opportunity to gain liberation from samsara altogether. So therefore, in this sense, then we realize that observance of moral ethics is really the foundation of all qualities, including that of obtaining the state of liberation.
Sanje ribata shapsun demba se ribata demba se shirab labata demba shapsun demba se tinta tingi labata ani chuding labata demba ribata shapsun demba se
So when we make praise to the Buddha by naming him from different kind of epithets, we call him the one with knowledge, the one who is grounded. Ripadam is knowledge, the one who is wise or knowledgeable, and then the one who is Shapsudamba in Tibetan means the one who is grounded. So therefore, when we say the one who is wise or knowledgeable, that basically talks about Buddha's qualities of the third training in wisdom. When we say the one who is grounded, then it talks about the qualities of the first two trainings, training in morality and training in training and concentration, samadhi.
Dene, deya meshiba donga juya koyi desu. Da 사람들이 예바 중서 고들 고시 고시도 가고 아니 뒤에서 고시부터 미시부터 도와주고 직접 뒤년부터 라바남 얘네 시바자 라잖아 숨제도 가르가리 얘네 아니 뒤시 마시네야 도와주와 준비 다 밤에 봐 도와주고 밤에 제야기 도와주고 밤에 인연부터 전시시다 뭐저치 돼야지 아니 들 발단된 맛에 밤에 봐 인연부터 전바다 시시 와주되네 전바 지 전바다 시시 네 동안 예배 좀 맞고 다제 진이들이 시시했어 그래 아니지 그래네 이 텔레로인도 잠바지 잠바 괜찮도 내가 텔레 아니 잠바 많이 봤어 이간에다 예배 좀 맞고 다니들 시시했어 뭐자세들 라주 전도 전에 예배를 드리는데 체여봐서 신 군주 친구제삼 남의 친구제삼 아니지 어떤 데서 전에 신 규전도 전에 예배를 드려야 돼 체여봐서 그래 어디에서 직디 되게 가르쳐서는 방매 인연부를 방매 세야지 무슨 배 장인도 다네 삼로만 담지 배 lö셔야 될 방매시 다지 당루에 되네 뭐자시 재미시 전시시 인제 뭐자 체육계네 받았는 거 자스지
So there are 4 doors or 4 opportunities or 4 occasions where we might engage in negative actions. So in order to refrain from engaging in negative actions, we have to guard those 4 doors or 4 possibilities where we might engage in negative actions. So the first door is the door of not knowing, and the door of ignorance. So therefore what that means is that the first way in which we engage in negative actions is because we don't know what to refrain from, what kind of positive actions to engage in, and so forth. So therefore, as an antidote, we have to train in the teachings. So we know the precepts. So we know what to engage in, what to refrain from, and so forth. Then the second door is the door of lack of conscientiousness, and that is even though we know that, even though we have knowledge, when we have no conscientiousness, we engage in negative actions nonetheless. So the antidote to lack of conscientiousness is through application of 4 factors. First is mindfulness, second is vigilance, third is conscience, and then fourth is cultivating a sense of embarrassment. So mindfulness, the first one basically is to be mindful, or to pay heed to, or to be mindful of one's own state of mind, and so that one refrains from negative actions, engages in all sorts of actions. And the vigilance is that function of the mind where we occasionally analyze and occasionally cultivate vigilance as to whether we are in fact engaging in negative actions or not. So that part of the function of the mind is called vigilance. And then the third is conscience. Conscience is with respect to one's own self. Even though nobody is looking, there's no one. We should cultivate self-conscience so that one is not engaging in negative actions. The fourth is because of cultivating a sense of embarrassment with respect to others. That if one does engage in negative actions, and one should feel embarrassed about it because of others. So when we cultivate these four things, then one is able to eliminate the lack of conscientiousness, that second door of negative actions. So the Tibetan words motsa, which means in the sense of embarrassment, and te means conscience. Conscience is, even though nobody's looking, you have to cultivate some sort of self-conscience. And self-conscience in kind of Buddhist practice is actually cultivated by understanding that even though there are no human people watching your negative actions, watching over your negative actions, there are Buddhas, there are omniscient Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who nonetheless know your negative actions. So therefore, conscience is cultivated based on remembering Buddhas. And so therefore, when we practice conscience like that, you are also engaging in the practice of remembering Buddhas. So we talk about 4 types of remembering practices, and this also, within this practice, one is also incorporating the practice of remembering Buddhas. So then the third door of negative actions is the door of prevalence of intense negative emotions. And so if we have this door, then even if we are practicing conscientiousness, then there's still danger that we will engage in negative actions because of the prevalence of intense negative emotions like hatred or like desire. So out of intense hatred, even though one is conscious of what one is doing, one can nonetheless engage in act of killing. One is intense kind of desire, that even though one is conscious, one can practice and conscientious. There's danger of engaging in sexual misconduct and so forth. And so therefore, the antidote to this third door of negative actions, which is the prevalence of intense negative emotions, is to train in the respective antidotal measures. So if there is intense desire, if the intense desire becomes more prominent, then we engage in the practice of seeing the ugliness of things, impermanence of things. When there is intense hatred, then we practice in the corresponding remedial antidotal practice of loving compassion and kindness. And when there is prevalence of intense negative ignorance, then we recognize as such, and then we meditate on the nature of interdependent nature of things, or interdependent understanding, that helps us to actually eliminate ignorance. So therefore, as and when a particular negative emotion becomes intense and manifest, then we have to directly engage in the counteractive measure. Otherwise, we cannot control this draw of negative action.
다들 먹어봐 동안쯤 그것을. 대인상 뒤기념부터 담발을 그거지야. 아니 뒤랍자 담발을 순간랍자. 제가 그거지야. 라바디 최신도 그거에 그거 참고서 그거지야. 대인상 라바 담발라바 최신도 롱얘기. 로드스로 그거지야. 로드스다. 제수나 아니 고지거리 제삼만그 동안 좀 그것이 그냥부터 들이.
So then the fourth draw of negative action is disrespect and disregard. So disrespecting the teachers and disrespecting the teachings and disrespecting the sangha becomes a draw of negative actions, because if we disregard and disrespect Buddhas and the teachers and the teachings, then this becomes a cause of engaging in negative action again. So it becomes the fourth draw. So as an antidote, then we cultivate respect towards the Buddhas, respect towards the teachers, respect towards the teachings, and respect towards the community of practitioners.
디바디 아니 그래서 그래. 지금은 뭐 마샤브체 아니 님부터 시지고요. 그래서 님부터 시제나 디바 컨디션에 따라 유유버디 상기 송고세. 저서 가디 고시 네 지 고시 그래서 그래. 손에 지 가디야. 동안 중수나 아니 중앙 동안 중앙디 좀 마샤베체 님부터 시고네 샤베체 그래서 디바 중수나.
So then if we are able to guard these four doors of negative actions properly, then there is no occasion where one might actually engage in negative actions. But nonetheless, because we are not mindful and so forth, that if we do commit negative actions, then we shouldn't leave it at that, but rather engage in the practice of purification, and through the application of the four powers of purification, because the Buddha said that there is no negative action that cannot be purified through purification practices.
That is it. 아니 샤금 진야디 아니 기부 담바스 돌레 딘데스 지데나 기부 담바 이니예데스 지달 고도모레 메도시 다 신도 권스 권야디 카레데스나 미게베 추미 제바단스 미게베 추미 제바디 신도 권버바 카나마토에 디버지에 바른 게바디 대한 신도 공부. 제사 대답은 신도 공부. 제사 기부 담배니디. 디바 카나마도 디바 미치베티 가서 디지 디바 제다 제네 니 기바게라티 샤도미 치니디 기부 담바스 미스 기부 담바스 디
So, in the Sudra, the Buddha said that there are two types of noble beings who are as rare to find as the Udumbara flower, a particular flower that blooms only during the Buddha's birth. So, the Buddha said that there are only two types of noble beings who are as rare as Udumbara flower. One is those who does not commit negative actions, and the other is those who engage in remorse and purification after having committed negative actions. So the Buddha said that these two individuals are very rare indeed.
다 디바 가제 전부 전에 다기 요바디데 아니 아니 그래서 시딘데 숨빈 거지. 관심 문제 밤이 좀 지내야다. 바단된 바 있고지. 대한다 나와 진짜 더블 잡지 남지디스. 단 가우소진 통된 대지 신스 다 중가우스제가우스야디 아니 소진스디 소메초 미국적들이 지세스 통된데 스디다 개그래 통된데 스디 개부 마치자다 아니 개부 대지 상부세 소진 통한 된된 대지스 개부 대지스 통한 된데세 디디 소메초 가사 개부 가사 마치자 어디 디즈 참이게 내지 봐 소진 소메초 조수비 미국제나 지세브로 아니디 디바샤니 그래서 그래 샤우tum제니 윤슈부터 받아 가시타 좀부터 시작돼 어디에서 소매청아 다 준비도 만들고 디바침부제니 더 비유리 자사 예심제니 샤우tum제 그래야 돼 예심.
So, even though this is the case, that it's rare to find an individual who does not commit negative actions, the quality of negative action, if we can put it that way, is that it can be purified. So therefore, Nagarjuna talks about this quality of negative actions, that they can be purified through compassional or purification practices. And Nagarjuna mentions how out of lack of conscientiousness, even if someone had engaged in grave negative actions, like the 5 types of uninterrupted actions, like killing one's parents and so forth, that through practice of conscientiousness later on, one can fully purify even these grave negative karma. And then Nagarjuna gives examples of Angulimala, who killed hundreds of people, and then later on, through conscientiousness and through practice, achieved the state of arhatut in that very lifetime. And then gives example, refers to the example of Ajat Shastru, another Indian king who killed his own parents, and then later on generated a lot of regret and remorse, and engaged in practices under the Buddha's guidance and achieved arhatut in that lifetime as well.
디 중고 세든 되자신도 치워지.
So then there is another example during Buddha's time, an individual person named Zhong Gaobo, who was supposed to have intense negative emotion of desire, and so therefore engaged in a lot of negative actions, and then he was able to change because of practice.
야, 다들 다들 최신도 불러봐. 또 전에 자우 다들 이모도 맞죠. 저자스죠. 이나는 때문에 이모도 된대서 예반남 마그 주된 넘버다 최신도 불러버 자우 여덟 진을 발라봐는 진을 스타트를 단대 뒤집은 진급수 라바 신이 수냐 말이 마순도가 지금 시단 모델 라바 순도가 라바 순람 타발리 라반들 라바 순스제는 단대 꾸들 추림 지고를 순도가 띠가를 선다지다 기부 침부도서 신에다 활동 세지 여러분 그래서 어디에서 신에다 활동 라바 가르스그래 어디에서 신에다 활동 기부 침부 ፈጅን 주그 시르그 ፈጅ 상대기 ፈጅ 되게 시리에라 어디기 어디 마시베 어디 지다 주린 빙의지다 시르
So then in the end it says, then I will learn properly a pure ethics which is not sullied by fault. Bless me, Lama deity, to be able to do that. So therefore, even though earlier there's a mention of three trainings, training in morality, training on concentration, and training in wisdom, in the end, one makes application to bless one so that one is able to actually observe pure moral ethics. So the reason why out of the three trainings only the moral ethics is mentioned here in the end is because this is within the context of the person of middle scope. The reason why this is only mentioned here, moral ethics, is because when we come to the circle of teachings belonging to the person of great scope, then there are two levels of trainings: training in concentration, training to give rise to calm abiding or single-pointed concentration, and then with that culminating in understanding the perfect view of wisdom. So both of these are actually part of training in concentration and training in wisdom. So therefore, because they will be covered during the discussions pertaining to the person of great scope, only the moral ethics is mentioned here because of that.
다들네 다순바 주드 지달자와 가시 전전 수수타게 문제지 랍자 다와서 나시 다들 지수타게 수수타게 나데 수수타게 문제지 다지다 수단의 셰베 증만 붙이야를 받디 충무가 시다야리 길 결혼을 주거래 냠스는 부야든지 열심히 지 한 번씩 있어야 됐다 지난해 로잉 있어야 됐다 뒤쳐라 뒤다 다 최신 충분히 네 침배임 충분히 랍제도 간거 수행 부분이야 재산 that 어때 디제 수소다 배는 메가 주고 저긴 미리 미리 주고 저긴 랍자가래도 랍자 그것도 수다 시부에 다 와서 나신스 다 진정스 가르쳐 버려서는 조중들 라바 라바 조중들 라바 본도 피하다 라바 조중 시기 숨겹지하다 라바 조중들 라베기 방자가리 다 두술 다도 제네 지부레스다
So then, then what to do during in-between sessions? So here it is mentioned that during in-between sessions, one should study the precepts, and one should study the precepts, the nature of the precepts, and how to observe those precepts and so forth. And of course, there are common precepts that we can study, and like the precepts of refraining from the 10 negative actions and so forth. And there are the uncommon precepts that only applies to when you actually receive like vows of fully ordained monks and so forth. So if you are not a fully ordained monk, you don't have to study them. But there are also a lot of common precepts, and you should study them during the in-between sessions.
Samba 기주 디시에 참여해 봐. 대다를 대다시네 그 평도가 이미 기지잖아. 이게 이제 그 잡았더니 존나 디디 민주기 발랐다. 기분 된지 네 전부 냠설랑 말했더니 간제 기분 된그 탄두로 디기 탄두도 로디기야 지 동네 계산부터 지 동네 삼바지다 동네 삼바 어두스 삼발에 때문에 아디 공지기 디큐 공중다 레지 공중다 너무 공중인데서 딱 간제 간지 기분 기분 된게 또 버기를 채지 간지 쉬자인가
So the actual realization that one is expected to achieve because of contemplations on the circle of teachings belonging to the person of middle scope is eventually to give rise to that thought of liberation or genuine renunciation that, as I've described earlier, is like like a prisoner who wants to get out of prison at all times. Very much like that, when one gains that single-pointed wish to gain liberation or seek liberation from samsara altogether by reflecting on the different types of suffering within samsara, as we discussed earlier, then that is the measure of having realized the specific realization of person of middle scope, which is basically to give rise to authentic renunciation.
그래서 그래 랑게 돈도 된대셈 계제장이 미면나 메남도야 미면나 신기 돈도 가르쳐 랑게 돈도 지 그와지다 제자도 동네에 탄두로 메남도야 미면나 아니 신기 돈도 신 그와지다 내가 동네에 좀도 그렇지 계세야 말이죠 제사 니주고 삼바세티 니주고 삼바세티 라는 주자들 하 동네에 과지를 동네에 젠두디 라는 주자는 무엇이지 과지다 제자기 동네에 젠두디 쓰면 시야를 삼나 민지시게 시야 동네에 젠두디 민지시게 어디 요새야 말해서 라 동네에 kuwada ngesumbi tungesam tele tandu lomena shen kuwada ngesumbi tunele tendu lokese yamaris jasa 민주 선거세 개침부심 지인스든지 남부 지설 중어들이
So, giving rise to authentic renunciation is extremely important when we come to the circle of teachings, when we engage in the practice of circle of teachings belonging to the person of great scope, because the main practice of the main practice for the person of great scope is compassion and bodhicitta. So without renunciation, and renunciation is basically with respect to oneself, without actually having reflected on one's own condition within samsara, by reflecting on the general sufferings within samsara, the 8 types of sufferings and so forth, by reflecting on the specific sufferings, the sufferings that are specific to each of the realms and so forth, and without generating a strong sense of fear and then the wish to gain liberation from these sufferings for oneself, which is renunciation by definition, there is no way that one can actually wish that kind of freedom for other sentient beings, which is compassion. So, in the practice of compassion, one generates the compassion that may all beings be freed from the sufferings of samsara in general and their specific sufferings. But that one can never reach such a state of freedom to other sentient beings if, first of all, one has not given rise to the freedom that one may actually gain freedom from these sufferings in the first place. So therefore, compassion in that sense is dependent on giving rise to renunciation with respect to oneself in the first place. So renunciation becomes the foundation of compassion. So because of this, Shantideva in his Bodhisattva's Way of Life actually mentions that if that kind of wish to seek liberation from all forms of suffering within samsara is something that one has never dreamed in one's dream for oneself, if one has failed to even dream such a state of freedom for oneself, then it would be impossible to wish that kind of freedom to other sentient beings. So therefore, this is the reason why, as I mentioned earlier, that renunciation is extremely important part of spiritual practice.
네. 다 니바 숨바 기고 친구 남기 니발라 로 자와라 자주도 생기주 얘네 줘발라 로주스 자주도 생기주 얘네 줘발라 로주스 이제 다 담부들라 자주도 셈이 개바 뭐다 셈기 초게 손주스 자주도 셈기 중에 제는 셈기 초게 손주스 이제 다지네 다스 자주 셈기 뭐들라 이제 내가 등기 자주도 셈기 주 다신년지 권에 자주도 셈기 주로스
So then we come to the circle of teachings belonging to the person of great scope or great capacity, and then here, in terms of the chapters or topics, it says the mind training in the stages of the path, the being of great capacity. This has two: the way to develop the altruistic intention to become enlightened for the sake of all sentient beings. That is basically the method of giving rise to bodhicitta. And then the second, which is not really mentioned here, the way it is presented here, the second main topic is then after giving rise to bodhicitta, how to train in the bodhisattva paths. So the two main topics. So the first topic, the way to develop the altruistic intention or bodhicitta, this has again two: the actual generation of altruistic intention, and this has two methods. One is generation of altruistic intention of bodhicitta by following the tradition of seven cause and effect, and the other is this. The other method is by following the tradition or the method of exchanging oneself with others.
근데 내가 등기 이번에 아니 자주 저도 생기지 시진기도 내가 시진기도 예지 두숨제 예지 두숨다 고림 러브 까말라시라기 고림레 마시 그게 내가 아니 두숨 또 어떤 내권에 생기지 저를 스타트
근데 하나 어디죠?
다른데 다신년들도 이제 샘티주도 동북으로 도제 루주진도 군대지 렌지 청와다 다신년지도 샘티주 10월에 다지学历进来，军年的吧，我的介绍，你 study。
So the two methods of generating bodhicitta, or two techniques of generating bodhicitta. The first is the technique of generating bodhicitta through seven cause and effect method. That is taught in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, what we call as the three Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the three mothers, the shorter version, the middling version, and then the extensive version of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And then it is also taught by Master Kamalashila in his middling stages of the path of meditation, middling stages of meditation by Kamalashila. It is also taught by Master Atisha. Then in terms of the second technique or second tradition of exchanging oneself with others, this is taught in a particular sutra called Dongbok Göbe Do in Tibetan, which actually translates as Sutra of Arrangement of Trees. And then it is also taught by Nagarjuna in his compendium of sutras, and it is also taught in his Ratnavali or Precious Garland. And this is also taught by Shyandideva in his Bodhisattva's Way of Life.
근데 내가 등기권에 전주쪽에서 예주당 다시 인식해주고 당원도 근데 내가 등기권에 전주쪽 생기와다 먼저 심재 통제 생명과 두바티스 주디스 다 심재 통제 생명과 마시고 먼저 마시 딩지스 그때 내가 인원도 심재 통제가 생명과 두바스 마시네 전주 바이기 공부 인계 디나니스 충분히 올라지다 저 전점 수지다 저 남부 종의 주다 되게 그래서 마시네 니제 담보디 그래서는 원도 현재 탐제라 생명부터 지지 마시네 전주기 생기발 공부티 니제 서지 니제 다 담보 심재 탐제라 생명부터 그들아 충분히 올라지 전점 수지라 니제 충분히 올라라 종의 수지 다 좋아하니 잠내 건들라 말아봐라 포함도 제차라 소리 집어지 디네 다다 마신제 탄 제기라 심제 탐제라 니리 차단사 제외 심명발 마시 딘지수 장니지 전주의 심제 도바 켜버지겨 나만의 진기로 시에서한테 지금 예체를 되는 다시 되는 오늘 당시 제가 심제 탐제는 니리 차단도 심명발 수 도바 켜버지는 이유기 진짜 소화되게 다 좋았지. 소화되면 준비해 배전제 좋아지.
So then, with respect to the first tradition or first method of cultivating bodhicitta through the 7 cause and effect method, this has again two. The first is the practice of cultivating equanimity towards all sentient beings, mental equanimity towards all sentient beings, and based on that, then in the actual practice of engaging in the 7 cause and effect method of inducing bodhicitta. So the first one, that is basically cultivation of equanimity towards all sentient beings, that has again 3: preparation, actual session, and concluding session. So in terms of preparation, then preparatory practice, it is exactly the same as before. Visualizing the Guru deity on top of your crown, and then making supplication. I pray to you, composite of the objects of refuge, my Lama, who is my special deity, subdual king and Vajradhara. And in response to that supplication, then after that, then you make the following prayer, as it is mentioned in the text. Lama deity, please bless me, bless the mental continuums of myself and all sentient beings, my mothers, to produce the special realization of even-mindedness, which is basically equanimity, which is free from attachment and aversion, holding close and keeping distant all sentient beings, and recognition of all beings as our mothers, remembering their kindness, repaying their kindness, loving compassion, and the altruistic intention to attain their highest enlightenment for the sake of sentient beings. So after this prayer, then you again visualize 5-colored nectar descending from the Guru deity into your crown, through your body, filling your entire body, and that of all sentient beings, and so forth, and then culminating in this conviction that the body of all sentient beings and your body transforms into a body that is pristine, clear, and radiant, and then your lifespan and good qualities increased, and in particular, then you think that these nectar filling your body gives rise to the special realization of equanimity towards all sentient beings that is free from attachment and aversion. So this is a preparatory practice.
단디 다님 미야디 다님 미야디다 라마스라 공신되는 펜을 가야 마제베 파메신제 진진도 세다 미네 이면에 대한 비지 내면도 랭간이 여러스니 펜도 랭간이 여러스니 내베제베 차니 미쳐와 미리 차단될 때 생긴 것이 자고 다디 근데 생긴 바디 대원대반요 그냥 라마 주변하나 동네 참모장에 men주지 대라나미야 초심해반이 다 되게 제반이 세티지 어디 대원대반요 동네 men주반요 쪽에 냐 어디 단지 라마 주변하네 뒤도가 어디 아니 어디 이 땅을 줘야 되지.
So then we start with the actual meditative session, and again we start by visualizing the Lama deity on top of your crown, then making supplications to the Lama deity to give rise to the realization of equanimity to all sentient beings. So therefore, while visualizing the Guru deity on your crown, then you visualize first of all neutral sentient being, somebody towards whom you have indifferent feelings, who has neither harmed you or nor helped you. So it's a neutral person. And then, first of all, cultivate equanimity with respect to this neutral person, which is easier. And then think that from this person's viewpoint, he or she does not desire suffering nor happiness. Does not desire suffering and desires happiness. And so therefore this is very much like what is actually in the Guru Puja, where Patanjali Sanskrit says that there is no difference with respect to oneself and others, in that that all do not want suffering, and all sentient beings are never contented with happiness, and this that there is no difference between oneself and others. So first of all, cultivate equanimity with respect to a neutral person.
다티 티티 니리 네버 냠도 대완데 바탄 투네 멘데바나 라데 지가 니 라다 니리 네버 아니 이니 다 차단게 세미는 비에 될때는 차단게 세미요 뭐 예산다 니리 차단도 저 당연히 용도가
So therefore, we equalize this person, this neutral person, with oneself, in that there is no difference between oneself and this person, in that both of us want happiness and do not want suffering. So that's one way of cultivating equanimity. But also the other equanimity is therefore we refrain from discrimination, of looking at this individual, literal individual, with attachment and aversion.
다 텔라 바르마 텔레 셈님 버 주차니 되네 셈님 버다 이도 이유 다른 뭐시 버지 셈제 진진도 세다 텔레 메네 셈님 버 버지 나 텔레 셈 마님 버나 텔레 셈 마님 버티 텔레 셈 마님 버니 차베 온기 버투스 다 셈 마님 버니 텔레 셈 마님 버시아티 다지 뭐시 버지 동화텔레 시체와 둘로 시체와요 현달레티 저 시체와 야마르바 대원 된주다 된주기 시체와 매버드 그래 텔레야 대원 된주기 로 시체와라 지체 현달데 대원 된주기 로 시체와 매버드 그래 제레스는 그 차베 온기 샤스 다데는 텔라스 마뇽바니 차베 온기 버두스 나리양 이도 이원을 세대 아니 그렇게 봐이냐 때 텔라스 마뇽바티 가르쳐도 세는 이도 알아 세베 차바티가 온기 레샤스 나야 이도 미베 세바티 온도 퀄리티 봐이도 냠네 세바카네 공부지 텔레야 세바카 이도 온도 세바티카.
So then after practice of equanimity towards that neutral person, then we change our object, and then we visualize a friend or a relative whom we find appealing, in the sense that we have loving fondness towards that individual, and then we begin to practice equanimity towards that individual person. And so we think in this way that we find that it is impossible to cultivate equanimity towards this person, and the reason for that is the reason why one is not able to practice equanimity is due to attachment to this person. And so then to cultivate equanimity, we reason that it is because of my attachment to what is attractive that has been responsible for my beginningless cyclic existence. Cyclic existence I've been have been propelled within certain existence because of attachment to what is attractive. So therefore, then we reason based on this reason, then we train our mind to eliminate craving and eliminate attachment.
다 되네. 세면년 반에 다 되지. 되네. 야. 이도 뭐 무엇이 생제 지진도 세다. 지금 내가 진행 신진 무엇인 것 같다. 들이 지수선다. 사이 미네. 세면년 반 세면년 반. 지 차단의 세면년 반 공부 잡았다. 내가 생명은 버티 다 삼로 다인지 감사하니 저도 삼리지 삼리지 야 시다나야로 다 되게 인도가 아직 멘데버 중으로 다 멘데버디 가르쳐진다 아멘 매년 번에 랑기 타지도 미팅 벌송한 디 소의 시다 개변이라 랑기 타지도 그 미팅 벌을 치소네 타치도 배 편도 매니를 주소네. 시다 기분이 샤스. 내가 쌤 많이만 자주기 쌤 기분. 아니 내 매년 시다가 공부지. 내가 쌤 많이만 자당기 쌤 많이만. 자주기 쌤 기분 그거 자니 야말이 쌤 시다가 공부지.
Then we change the object of our visualization, and then we visualize a person who is our enemy or somebody who we find disagreeable. And then the thing in this way that the reason why I cannot practice equanimity towards this person is because I find this person completely disagreeable. And then we reason that if we continue to have this kind of discrimination towards this person, if I continue to lack equanimity, then there is no way I can develop bodhicitta or altruistic aspiration to achieve enlightenment for all sentient beings, because that is our goal. And so, based on this reason, then we make a commitment to stop aversion and anger towards this individual person. Then after these, then you visualize two sentient beings. One who is attractive to oneself, like one's mother, and someone who is not attractive or we find disagreeable, like one's enemy. And then visualizing these two different individuals, then we practice equanimity towards these two different individuals through this reasoning, that both of these individuals are equal in that they do not want suffering and that they want happiness. And so therefore, based on this understanding, then we cultivate this understanding as to um, the lack of reason in generating aversion towards one and generating a craving towards the other, and then make a commitment to eliminate craving and aversion and practice equanimity towards both.
that's never Chinese Mijava Niri Chadan the Diamond Shikjao, Dedachina Velamanich, Machine, or that in it, Sanjay that in it, teacher Sanjay what do that in it, some Nimbana, Sanjay Tamjela, some Nimba. Then Sanjay Tamjes, that Jeda read Jenna Semyamba to the dinner, Sanjay Tamjes, Nimba, Sanjay Tamjelas, Nimba Kubachimani, Tijuni, Sanjay Tamje, when it want to name it to Batsun. Rang when Sanjay Tamjel, near Imbe, Rang when it Sanjay Tamjelang near Shas, near Imbe, Gashila, Rosune. Gashila Remerson, never Jiva, Chinese Michiva, nearly Chadan the Jury. Some member she chow, the Dutch in the Lamala Jimmy, so at the Lamala, so at the bit of virginity. Daniel to be Dutch to them on the summit that time. Nearly Chadan Jerry into Jerry made it to Jim on the summit, that's some time.
So we further reason that this individual called my relative or my mother has been my enemy for a number of lifetimes since the beginning of this lifetime, and also my enemy has also been my mother and cared for me number of times since the beginning of this lifetime. So through this reasoning, then you say, therefore, to whom should I be attached to, and to whom I should be averse to? And so, therefore, through this reasoning, one cultivates equanimity, free from aversion and craving, and then with this, we at the end one makes a supplication to the Lama Guru to bless you to be able to cultivate such state of equanimity. And after cultivating equanimity towards individual beings in this way, training of cultivation of equanimity towards individual beings in this way, then we cultivate equanimity towards all sentient beings. And so therefore we say that all sentient beings from their own side are similar in that they want happiness and do not want suffering. And from one's own side, all sentient beings have been one's relatives in one lifetime or the other. And so therefore, in this way, you cultivate a sense of intimacy, and therefore, you eliminate all kind of discrimination of dividing sentient beings into so-called friends and enemies, and use different reasons and logics to actually destroy that discrimination, to be able to cultivate equanimity. And at the same time, then you seek blessings of the Guru Didi to be able to give rise to such realization within yourself. So this is what is meant here. Bless me, Lama Didi, to be able to do that.
That's some material leverage. Some eliminate some material leverage. Chonsona, and that combat that sales.
So the measure of having cultivated equanimity towards sentient beings is when one gains freedom from discrimination and the associated discomfort or suffering. Usually, when we come across with somebody we are averse to, or some conversation that we are attached to, it gives rise to some sort of discomfort because of this dualism. But when there comes a time when one is free from such reactions of attachment and aversion, then that is the measure of having generated equanimity.
Tene machine Janjuki Sim Par Kumjuni, Jerulama Kumshibes, Nani, Tatinisa, Kandichinam, Kandicikone, Julama Kumshibekune, Nani Chu, Lamane, Julam so Jenny, Nani, Ona Simja Tamje, Tagi, Vicute, Chidarishinas, Tati. Simjetanjaran Nisha, Veshi Nyorasan, Veshi Rimasun to Slavaba. On it does Simjetanjaran because they can listen. Koala Toma Meve, Tagi, Kivala and Tomame. Kiva Jine Jitu, Judy, Yuchoda, Sajo, Dirma Gicha, Chichame, Kivala Tangimachu, Simjeti, Malam Chava. Langara Tangimachu. Any D. Dog Mama Jeva Chicame, Jevala Tangimachu. Sinjeri Rijan, me Della, Dagima, Macheva Chicame, Jevala Tangimachu. Tanduya Jevaribu. Tanduya Quale Madrina, Machiva. Then Jingi Jambe, Machi Jan, Yin, then Simja Tamja Rangi, around a Jingi Jambe, Machi Jan, Yin, some Machi.
So then, after generation of equanimity towards all sentient beings, we begin with the actual generation of bodhicitta towards all sentient beings through the 7 cause and effect method. And first is seeing all sentient beings as having been one's mothers. And so therefore, it says here, meditating on the Lama deity on the top of your crown, think as follows. So the reason why it says meditating on the Lama deity all the time is as part of the tantric practice. In the tantric practice, the Guru Yoga is the heart of the practice. The Guru devotion and Guru Yoga is the heart of it. So therefore, when engaging in these trainings, we always meditate or visualize the Lama deity on top of your crown, and then engage in the training or contemplation. So therefore, the first is seeing sentient beings as having been one's mothers. So this is how we train to get to that realization. If someone should ask, well, what is the reason that all sentient beings are my relatives? As there is no beginning to such existence, there is no beginning to my birth. And within that continuum of going from life to life, I cannot point but one place of direction into which I have not been born. Those births are countless. I cannot point one type of body of a sentient being that I have not assumed. And I cannot count the number of times that I have assumed that type of body. I cannot point out even a single sentient being who has not been my mother. I cannot count the number of times that they have been my mother. And there is no sentient beings who has not been my mother in a human form. I cannot count the number of times that they have been and still will be my mother in a human form. Therefore, I should think that all these sentient beings are by all means my mothers who have kindly cared for me.
Oh, that's it. And Simja Tanjarangi, Simja Tame, but Simja Tanjarangi, Simja Tame, but Simja Tame, when I should run for the Kayamaris, Jip, Ya, 생겼던데 랑기 많이 나는 랑기 마마시고야 마마신배 해서 랑기 마마리스는 마마신의 랑기 마마신배 야리 세디리 랑기 많이 나는 마마신이 마마야 디 마마인배 규양을
So through these different reasonings, we eliminate doubt with respect to seeing all sentient beings as having been one's mothers. So first of all, if the doubt is that all sentient beings can never be one's own mothers, because there are countless number of sentient beings, then the way to eliminate that doubt is by actually understanding that just as there are countless number of sentient beings, our life has also been countless. There is no beginning to one's life, so the number of lifetimes that we have taken is also countless. And if the second part of the doubt is, if sentient beings have been my mothers, how come I do not actually recognize them? Then you can reason this by saying that even in this lifetime there are cases where children do not actually recognize their mothers, but that doesn't mean that they are not their mothers. Therefore. So, Rinpoche said that's exactly the manner in which we are seeking the blessings of the Guru Buddha, because when you visualize the Guru Buddha on top of your crown, you visualize the Guru as Buddha, and separate from the Buddha. So when the Buddhas actually engage in the activity of benefiting other sentient beings, there is no conceptual thought. So therefore Buddhas do not entertain the thought that says, okay, I'm going to help this sentient being, or I'm going to help that sentient being because he's praying to me. But rather that in that non-conceptual state, because of the power of the Buddha's prayers and compassion, whenever beings come across with the right kind of conditions, including the condition of praying fervently to them, then they are able to benefit sentient beings. So so we have to understand that there is no intention on the part of the Buddhas. Nonetheless, because of the power of prayers and bodhicitta, that they are able to help beings whenever they come across with the right disciples, with the right karmic connection and the prayers and so forth. Very much like, if we can hear some sounds from the movement of the trees because of the winds, if you can hear the sound, the trees do not have any kind of intention that says, I'm going to produce this particular sound, right? So very much like that, the Buddhas do not have any actual intentions. But when we actually seek their blessings, it is in that sense that we are basically invoking their prayers, their blessings, and we are giving rise to the right appropriate conditions to activate their blessings. So we're talking about a sort of interdependence, where, like, for example, if there is a good field, and then we're going to cultivate some crops, and then we give rise to right conditions like fertilizers, protecting them from animals, sunlight and so forth, then the field is going to produce good crops. But from the side of the field, there is no conceptual intention that says, okay, now I'm going to give, good crops this year. I'm going to give good crops, I'm not going to give crops, like next year and so forth. There is no such intention. But rather, when we give rise to all the necessary causal conditions, then good crops are produced. So very much like that, we are talking about a very subtle interdependence, where when we give rise to all the subtle causal factors, then even in the absence of a conceptual intention from the Buddhas, we are able to basically benefit through their blessings.
Yeah, that's very.
Okay, any more questions?
Well, in this idea of the Buddha doesn't speak of any one individual person, what happens when someone dies and you give prayers for someone who just died? That's a very individual request.
So what? Very good question. Because Sangela, double yomra, you could get what didn't deal or watching some of your Nikansa didn't deal or watching being like that. Mulam Jackson, Tangata watching the double yomra. In a young music, Tondu of Laya, then was something to Chochi was. That Tondu of Laya, that me gets you to wish you were us. That they let Sangi get the laptop. I'm talking about the watching some of your own humorous.
Yeah, but it's the community teaching and it can't get my mom research. Teaching, but to us. Something to take care of it. You can't get you to this. In there, it's so at the Nashiki. Robert Yaris.
So, if you look at your early example, to that particular individual request, the Buddhas do help. Because of the subtle causal interdependence, help is actually received. But as I mentioned earlier, the Buddha does not have this conceptual thought. By definition, Buddha is somebody who is free from dualism of subject and object. So the Buddha, does not entertain the thought saying that, okay, now I'm going to help this individual because this individual is praying to me right now. Because then, by definition, then we can say that Buddha will also have some sort of mental suffering when he fails to help all sentient beings, right? Like somebody, prays to the Buddha and said, okay, I could help this individual, but I cannot help that individual, right? So when you are in the domain of conceptual thought, then we also have to logically say that Buddha has some sort of mental suffering as well. But by definition, Buddha is somebody whose mind is basically non-dual and free from dualism of subject and object. But it doesn't mean that therefore Buddha has no wisdom, has no knowledge. Buddha knows, Buddha perceives, but directly, without any conceptual dualism. So therefore there's a difference, the way we know ordinarily is through conceptual knowledge, but the Buddha nonetheless knows, but directly without any such conceptual dualism.
So can I ask a real quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Then the 35 confession Buddhas, it's taught that there was a time when they made prayers to be able to help beings in the future during degenerative times. So that was conceptual, and they weren't Buddhist yet. They were on the path. So then it would follow that they're able to help, again, not from conceptual, but it started way back from their wish, which was conceptual. Is that correct?
여러분이 상길라 다 떠보면 있나? 아니 상기 대시 숨주송의 동시에 나가지고 tudu gobla di na mulam nila tungu dos ne ngam ngema de beji gobla ya ni simje tamje ji ne la kebe gi tamje chere ji mulam je se ji tudu gobla tokbe gi mulam gi ji dos di lam na lobe ne gobla dos lam lobe ne ga di gi tokbi tena sang ge wa ina ya di mulam gi tokbi ta togo ne ne ro ko chi go di lam di go res so that is exactly the case that the term when they are still on the path, they made powerful aspirational prayers, and these are giving fruit, even though at the enlightened state there is no concept.
다디 마시기 건도 다 땅인 공부가 가마 레시베 숨에 chung 이시 쟁업에 그래서 내 잠바 잠베 마님나 땅인 미용 발송 내 잠베 내 셈마님나 땅인 셈미야야 말이스 땅이 공부 누구를 숨지 어디에서 이니야 이네 제름 치기다 까말레시나 있는 신체니지 마시는 땅인 공부지 저기 저는
So, the tradition of contemplating or meditating on equanimity prior to engaging in the actual practice of giving rise to bodhicitta is taught by Kamalashila, and Tsongkhapa actually follows Kamalashila's tradition and therefore teaches this technique of contemplating on equanimity prior to engaging in the actual method of giving rise to bodhicitta. But there is another tradition, like one of the Kadamba masters, Kishi Chengawa. He says that there is no point in engaging in the practice of equanimity because he says, if I am not able to is a kind of play with word a little bit, but if I'm not able to equally extend my compassion towards all sentient beings, then prior to that, there is no point in actually cultivating a sense of equanimity. That a mental equanimity prior to extending compassion equally is not authentic equanimity. So therefore, in that tradition, Chengawa says that we can start with practice of compassion right away, and compassion will, when it kind of extends to all sentient beings equally, is the authentic equanimity. So there's no need and no point to engage in equanimity prior to compassion practices.
양 돌레데 잠 냠베심다 잠베심다 파메심 속이 아이무스 인데스 타임 순가 다탄데티 타임티 대원대원 냠바다 던질라마 주변나시 그래서 그래 아마 주변나 내 참으면 되지 때라는 주심이 많이 세나시제 단다 마시고 공도 대원대원 냠바다 그놈들은 냠베 권에 다 차다가 주지 야 영원히 잠바 공인도 야 쌤 냠바디 선제 탄도 이고 영원히 잠바 공인지 어디 비야지 영원히 잠바 공에 쌤 냠바 주지 차다시 주지 야 파다 매심데스 선제 탄도 파마도 이제 탐지 마다부슨 이 냠송이야 차단지 시주가 어디에서 어딘지 지송도가
And also related to this, in the sutras, Buddha actually mentions of 3 types of equanimity or practice of equanimity. The first equanimity is, as it is actually taught by Kamalashila, by cultivating equanimity on the basis or on the ground that all sentient beings are equal, whether they are one's enemies or friends or neutral people, that they want happiness and they do not want suffering. So that's one way of cultivating equanimity. The next equanimity, the next type of equanimity that is mentioned in the sutras is the equanimity that is cultivated through the practice of loving fondness. Loving fondness, Yong Chamba, seeing of every sentient being as precious and intimate. So when we are able to cultivate that, then that also induces a kind of equanimity towards all sentient beings. Equanimity in the sense that one then gains freedom from discrimination of reacting with craving and aversion. Then the next type of equanimity that is taught in the sutras, mentioned in sutras, is the equanimity of seeing all sentient beings as one's fathers and mothers. And through that, one is able to generate a state of equanimity, free from aversion and craving. So in the text, there are techniques to eliminate doubt with respect to seeing sentient beings as one's mothers. So as I mentioned earlier, if one of the doubt is that because there are countless number of sentient beings, it is impossible that all of them could have been one's mothers, then we have to counteract this doubt or eliminate this doubt by understanding that our life is also countless. The number of lifetimes that we have taken is also countless. But then the second doubt is, if that is the case, how come I do not recognize them? And therefore, it can be the case. Then we should also understand that there are, even in this lifetime, there are children who do not recognize their parents because of separation at birth and so forth. That doesn't underscore the fact that there are still, parents to these children. And then the third doubt is, is one might actually think that, but those were my parents in previous lifetimes, so that doesn't count. What counts is that, the mother of this lifetime, and whatever happened in the past, that doesn't count. So therefore, if it's a question of time frame, then we have to actually eliminate this again misconception by saying that there is no difference between the mother, between yesterday's mother and today's mother. Because even though the time has changed, but yesterday's mother we still respect the same today, even though the time is different. So very much like that, then we kind of cultivate the conviction that there is no difference between the mother in the previous lifetimes and the mother in this lifetime, because there is no difference in terms of their kindness rendered to us. And so in this way, through different reasoning and contemplations, there comes a time when we are able to actually experience internally this intuitive understanding of seeing sentient beings as mothers. Then that is the measure of having gained the first realization, the realization of seeing all sentient beings as one's mothers. So therefore the measure of having gained the realization of seeing all sentient beings as mothers is when you, from the point of your own experience, when you actually have this experience of seeing all sentient beings just like one's own mother in this lifetime, in the sense that you are able to cultivate the same level of intimacy, love, closeness, and caring for all sentient beings as one can do towards the mother in this one lifetime, then that is the measure or standard of having obtained or achieved the first realization, the realization of seeing all sentient beings as one's mothers.
말랑 소라 바바 더비 동네 중앙에 다 중세 나나 동네 치 답이 동네 중앙에 다 중세 나와라 동네 쳐서 마크라지 소라 바바 동네 치 나르소네 아니 지 그디 동네 나와디 동네 쳐서 그런디 내기 나라들이 그냥 몇십만 명 부디 아니 내게 나왔지가 아니 몇십만 배 돈이 쳐 이제 대동 땅에서 대바다 돈이 땅에 랑소리야 마타버 샤탕던 쪽에 세너 탐지 대바다 동에다 땅에 마다와테 수수소 저지게 배준비 네 샤탄도 가리 마비죠 도시에 세노르도스 탐제 달레지레 프로스 디 이게 소중지야 이제 마랑이 캐리어다 준비 캠바다 대화 체험이 그것도 말한디 지 지금 변조이네 거리네 내주기 지금 라미 옆에 내주기 준비 캠바다 대화 체험을 이야기했어 내가다 동네 체험을 이야기 그래 진실도 진영상 어다 진실이
So then, after experiencing the realization of seeing sentient beings as one's mothers, then we go to the next of the 7 steps, which is basically remembering the kindness of mother sentient beings. So, in order for this practice, again you visualize Lama Deity on top of your crown. And then it says, meditate on the clear appearance of this mother, of this life's mother in front of you, not when she is young, but when she is old. So it is said that, if you visualize the mother when she is older, it is easier to actually remember her kindness. And then, by visualizing your mother of this lifetime in this way, then you can contemplate in this way. So this is straightforward in the text. My mother has been so, not only in this lifetime, kind, that is, but but innumerably from beginner's lifetime. In particular, in this lifetime, she sustained me at first with love in her womb. At birth, she placed me on a soft cushion. She lifted me towards her on the tips of her 10 fingers, held me to the warmth of her flesh, welcomed me with a loving smile, looked at me with joy-filled eyes, wiped snot from my nose with her tongue, and cleaned my excrement with her hand. Giving birth to me, she suffered much more than me, as if she were losing her life. Then at the slightest illness, she suffered greatly. So when the mother sees her own son or daughter suffering, the mental suffering, her mental suffering is much greater than the suffering of the mental suffering of the child. She provided me with measureless happiness and benefit in accordance with her own resources. She gave me lovingly all her wealth, which she obtained by working her fingers to the bone, without considering her wrongdoing, suffering, repetition, or even her own life. And so in this way you think that because she protects me from immeasurable misery and harm, she is extremely kind.
다들라 스님이 뭐 전체적이네 팔라 파수 아니 chuni hala soba number set susu pay number set la ne mini di cheru toma ne dali mama che batong ne juice tane te mama che betene yang chidigi me dingi jamban shindu dingi jamban shindu na kati
So when you have experienced that with respect to your mother, then it says meditate on other close ones, such as your father. The way of doing that is as follows. After visualizing the form of someone close to you, such as your father, think in this way. This person has been my mother countless times throughout my beginner's lifetimes. when he was my mother, he cared for me with kindness, just like my mother of this lifetime did. Therefore, this person is extremely kind.
Tatine parme simje mini. Andi te parme simje jikta, ndi seta. Tita tane tada dinam lan jawa deme tanda shidu news. Tada nyende te parme simje tita rang jawa meba tabu chidus. Dinam cherak thoma mebane tal mam chebala thami tada jawa meba tabu ini cherak mama thandi to ma chebala thami mama chebe chia chendigi ma sidar jingi jambana shi jingi jang istane jinshin du cheyin
So then, once you gain a degree of experience with that, then you change your object of visualization, and then you visualize in front of you many neutral sentient beings, and then think in this way. Right now it seems that there is no connection at all between myself and these beings. However, these beings have been my mother's countless times throughout my beginningless lifetimes. When they were my mothers, they cared for me with kindness, just like my mother of this lifetime did. Therefore, they are extremely kind.
Tatine tala mini dindu sam ane tate tala suwa di jishi chas tate tala suwa di kun suya midu sansar che di chera thoma mebane tagi ma chabala tangi mende ma che bechani ya pemba ta dewa che mebatu yu ane neba ta dunga che mebale kebi tagi che dili mebale tenji chebari di chera nama neba ta dunga che mebale kebar tagi di mena 중세 되면 수거든. 개발도 다기디 배 조부 이동 디지 매나 중세 장 되면 수거 맞추거든. 디장 다음에는 중세 장 되면 수거들 이주가 전에 되가 제스 자디기 지 자디 수수면에 배이 되면 수거로 수수에 된게 되면은 되면 저들 배 이주 마부제를 시켜 마부는 다리 내지 자체를 미슈 다음에 되버지 다다네 그 된다 그거라 nembe 온기 인도 다단다 내도 된다 그거 레님베 온기 인도도 그 내가 지어야 다다란 내가 지어야 당
So then, after that, you change your object of visualization, and this time you visualize in front of you your enemies. And so, by visualizing the enemies, then you have to think in this way: what is the use of holding these now as enemies? These beings have been my mother's countless times throughout my beginner's lifetimes. When they were my mothers, they provided me with immeasurable benefit and happiness. They protected me from immeasurable harm and suffering. And so you have to think that even though they harmed me in this lifetime just once, the number of times they benefited me when they were my parents or my mother is countless. So they protected me from immeasurable harm and suffering. And so we've been so intimate with this enemy, with these enemies, that when they were not around during those times in the past lifetimes, I could not stand even slightly still. Moreover, when I was not around, they could not stand even slightly still. So we were, in that sense, intimate in that way, countless number of lifetimes. So this present situation of us being enemies is due to my own negative actions. These are a portion of my negative actions. Otherwise, they are only my mothers who care for me with tremendous kindness. So this is how you meditate or contemplate.
어디 다디 디다 팅팅디 어디 팅팅시아디디리 디 근데 내가 두기난 기 정도 팅팅시아디다 경험에 팅팅지 어디 팅팅시아디 다신년지 급수야 팅팅지 다디 경험하게 뒤숭비 팅팅마 경험에 내가서 팅팅지 친디 내가서 팅팅지 마음반에 이게 사이 부과다 현지 자주 있습니다. 어때지 마음반에 생길 부과도 여기 땡도 팅팅 그래서 팅팅 주스 어디 디지 이제 다단데 디 친구네 팅팅 주지
So that is the practice of remembering the kindness of Mother Sentient Beings. There is practice of remembering the kindness of Mother Sentient Beings within the context of 7 cause and effect method, and within the context of exchanging oneself with others practice. So it is said that within the context of 7 cause and effect, when we remember the kindness of Mother Sentient Beings, we usually remember the kindness, predominantly it is a practice of remembering the kindness of Mother Sentient Beings in the past lifetimes. But when it comes to exchanging oneself with others tradition, when we remember the kindness of Mother Sentient Beings, we remember the kindness of Mother Sentient Beings in 3 times, in previous lifetimes, in this lifetime, and also in future lifetimes. So we're going to stop here for this evening. We just said we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Okay, so the question is from Antendula. The question is the question is, how come the Lamrim teachings on equanimity don't mention that all sentient beings possess Buddha nature, so that we are equal in that fundamental respect? 이제 내 고라게 되고 들으셨다. 람림기 초고달라고 와. 아니 땅념 검득걸려야 심지 담지라 땅념 검득라. 심지 담지라 대신 닝보 유배 참네. 대신 닝보 끌어 유배 참네. 땅념 검주도 승고는 도스. 어디 가이나스. 비전에 가서 찍고 나왔어.
근데 생겼다니. 이제 다음 주에 쌤이 왜 차례? 나중에 두 그거지.
So then in that logic, if you follow this logic, then you can also cultivate equanimity towards all sentient beings because they all possess mind.
좋아요, 처리.
Because they have all,
그치?
because they have all the feelings and compositional actions, because they have 5 psychophysical aggregates.
One is teaching this meditation to people who are not Buddhists but are very interested in the meditation. What sort of reasoning could be used if said people don't really know incarnation?
그래서 뭐지 장접선기 검토기 근데 내가 된지로 어디 낭방 마인백이 아니 미드줄라 티에이도 이거이나 아니 개운하지 켈린 거 말아 안 근데 근데 뭔가 보는데 이제 저리선 깨단데 티단도 줘놨어
야,
저 개운하지 켈만나
다시 냠지. 전주 쓰는구나.
So for individuals who do not believe in rebirth, the other method is more appropriate. That is the cultivation of bodhicitta based on exchanging oneself with others. That is more relevant and appropriate.
So just leave the other one
Yeah.
alone. Okay, thank you.
아니면 맛이 좋다는 맛이 좋. 저거 너무 좋다는 저거 너무 좋다서는 아니지.
Maybe the other way is, you can prove the existence of rebirth. And then based on that, prove that all sentient beings have been once mothers. So maybe that's another way.